Ash had this idea that we would have a directing staff little working group and have some project that we worked on together for the year. And the group consisted of Ash, myself, Charles Zraket, who had been head of the MITRE Corporation out in Bedford, a private not-for-profit military contractor, and Kurt Campbell, who's now in the White House running our China policy. So we were starting to have some discussions about what should we do, what would we like to do. In the midst of this, there's this coup against Gorbachev. It fizzled out after a few days. Gorbachev resumed authority, managed to hang in there for another few months. That's a separate story. But in the midst of all this, the Bush administration addressed some inchoate fears about nuclear command and control by saying, we had no worries, no problems here. Don't get fussy about these nuclear issues, because nobody knew what had happened with respect to command and control of Soviet nuclear weapons when Gorbachev was in the South, out of Moscow, in house arrest. There was a group of coup makers who at least briefly assumed control. And insofar as they had control over thousands of nuclear weapons that were targeted on locations in the United States. This seemed to us a pretty consequential. So we were talking about this and thought to ourselves collectively, this can't be right? The Bush dismissal of this issue can't be right. That is to say, there's nothing to worry about here. But furthermore, the story was not over, because Gorbachev survived the coup, but the Soviet Union was still coming apart at the seams, and it was happening right in front of our eyes. And so we resolved, the four of us, to write a short piece for foreign policy, kind of agenda setter, saying, here's an issue we ought to pay attention to. And 3 exhausting months later, what we actually published was Soviet nuclear fission. Because we divvied up some chores, we gave each other assignments, we dug into this problem. We came back to our weekly meeting the following week, and basically whatever anyone else thought about this issue, we had scared the shit out of ourselves. But with just a little bit of digging, it rapidly became apparent that this was potentially a massive nuclear issue, and that if it went badly, it could have really disastrous repercussions, both for American interests and for global security. And so we plunged into this. And meanwhile, the turmoil in the former Soviet Union is roiling. So the problem is happening right in front of us. We identified 3 problems. One was unauthorized use, that is, as the state authority was waning, could proper authorities retain appropriate control over the use of nuclear weapons? The second was proliferation. By this time, we're talking fall of '91, nuclear weapons had been removed from the 3 Baltic states, which were the earliest to have asserted sovereign independence claims. But the other 12 republics all had either strategic or nuclear or tactical or both nuclear weapons deployed on their territories. And if the Soviet Union devolved into its constituent parts, these states would in a sense be born nuclear. And this had the potential to be a terrible blow to the non-proliferation regime as we had experienced it. It would be an unprecedented burst of proliferation. And so there was this debate to some extent over what outcome should the US prefer. In our monograph, we strongly argued that the United States should prefer a single nuclear successor state, and that successor state should be Russia, not because of any preference for Russia, but because it was the only state that had the full infrastructure to provide sort of soup to nuts custodianship of the nuclear arsenal. But Zbigniew Brzezinski was arguing that an independent Ukraine was more important to the United States than preventing a nuclear Ukraine. John Mearsheimer and I debated in foreign affairs. He made the case that Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons as the only true guarantor of its security against what he saw as the inevitable eventual assault from Russia. And 20 years later, many people would say John had a point. I still think he was wrong for reasons that are too complicated to get into here. But the point is that it wasn't obvious that the answer in the American body politic was going to be a single nuclear successor state, but that's the conclusion we came to. And then the third issue, which Matt and John both played a big role in, and Matt, I think, was one of the real leaders in this area, was the so-called loose nukes question. So the Soviet Union had manufactured 40,000 nuclear weapons. It had the world's largest nuclear infrastructure. It had this very scattered nuclear empire. And the security of that empire was basically intimately linked to the oppressive nature of the Soviet state. It was a police state, and that police state made it difficult to get either in or out of the Soviet Union, and it made it more or less impossible to get to the closed cities where the nuclear infrastructure was located. And so there was a concern that if the Soviet Union came apart at the seams, its nuclear complex might also come apart at the seams. And if the police state ceased functioning, the level of security that was associated with the world's largest infrastructure of both industrial nuclear capacity and nuclear materials and nuclear weapons would also come apart at the seams. So there was a real fear that what we would have is a tremendous hemorrhage of nuclear assets out of the former Soviet Union, that this would then supply a nuclear black market to anyone who had the money to pay the market price, and that this would destroy the sort of technological choke points around which the NPT was built. And this hence looked like a really urgent priority for us. So those were the three big issues, the unauthorized use question, the proliferation question, and the loose nukes question. We argued these were huge American interests, that the issue was not hypothetical, but real, that the timing was not later, but now, that the need for action was urgent and immediate. We called for what I think we described it as unprecedented agility on the part of the US government in responding to this crisis. Meanwhile, as we were doing this and getting it published, there was actually some activity in Washington aimed at addressing some aspects of this question. And in particular, Nunn and Aspen, Senator Nunn and Congressman Aspen, put forward a bill in the Congress, known shockingly as the Nunn-Aspen bill. And it allocated, I think it was $100 million to, at any rate, it allocated some sum of American taxpayer money to the purpose of preventing a nuclear catastrophe in the former Soviet Union. This bill failed to attract the support of the Bush administration, was criticized by Secretary of Defense Cheney as a needless delusion, I think was the phrase he used, and was roundly defeated. In fact, the vote against it was so overwhelming that Nunn and Aspen withdrew the bill from consideration in November of 1991. So at this point, Soviet nuclear fission has just been published, middle of November of 1991. So Nunn-Aspen has just been defeated. Ash Carter, bless his heart, is one of these people who believes whatever is worth doing yesterday. And so we ordered boxes and boxes of this thing. It ended up in the Belfer library. The entire center, including myself, was mobilized to stuff copies and to pre-labeled. All of our whole mailing list was going to get these if Ash had anything to do with it. there was probably 250 Federal Express envelopes of people who Ash believed needed to get it tomorrow. And it was out there. One of the recipients was David Hamburg, the president then of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which was the foundation supporting us at the time and supporting this work. And he was
can you turn it off when you go in? Good.
This was Hamburg was quite taken with this analysis, by which I mean he was horrified by the potential downside risks. And so he arranged, I'll shut up. He arranged a meeting with Nunn and Lugar in late November, a week after the defeat of Nunn-Aspen. Nunn and Lugar were quite impressed by the analysis, swore to work together on this question, ordered immediately their staff to draft some new legislation. They added Ash to the drafting team since he had been the one who had briefed them. 2 days later, they organized a much wider circle of senators, bipartisan group, including heads of the key committees and heads of the Republican Party, which is very important. And within a week or two was passed the Soviet Nuclear Threat Reduction Act of 1991, which succeeded in doing what Nunn-Aspen had a week before failed to do, which is authorize the US government to spend US taxpayer money addressing nuclear safety and security issues in the former Soviet Union. So that's kind of the story of one of our dramatic episodes. We did a sequel called Cooperative Denuclearization, where we, in anticipation of a new administration, whoever it was in 1993, we did an assessment of what's been accomplished, what remains to be done, and how can we get done what remains to be done. At that point, there were still nuclear weapons scattered across multiple former Soviet republics that were now newly independent states. Some of them had within their borders advocates of retaining the nuclear weapons. And so this was, again, one of these cases where we felt we had a large stake in the outcome. We had unfinished business in terms of American interest. It wasn't at all clear how it was going to come out. And so we did a sequel that actually then fed into President Bill Clinton's first April 1993 summit with Boris Yeltsin. So that's kind of the short version. Maybe it wasn't so short. Anyway, that's the story.
I can't wait to hear the long version.
So John, this transitioned very well into what I wanted to ask you. So you were in government at the time, 1993, the Clinton administration. Then you were later.
He was an advisor.
Advisor.
I was not in government. I was
Right.
still a professor.
You were an advisor.
Yeah.
So, and you also, as you described yesterday, you had incredible relationships with the Russian scientists. So how would you describe that moment, and what do you think were really the challenges for you in thinking about policy?
Well, I talked about some of them yesterday, and let me say that the way the world looked to me at the end of 1995, just before I came to Harvard at the beginning of July of 1996, I described in my Nobel address for Pugwash. And there's a reference to that was on the slides yesterday. And I would actually save a lot of time here by suggesting that people who want to know how the world looked to me in 1995 should take a look at that address. Because it starts with a picture of the world after the end of the Cold War and the challenges that still remain. The basic argument in that address was, yes, it's great the Cold War is over. The danger of thermonuclear war has receded somewhat. We should be thankful for that. But anybody who thinks we're out of the woods is not thinking clearly. And here are the following 6 reasons that that the world is still a very dangerous place. And that included the danger of loose nuclear weapons. It included the danger of a resumption at some point in very damaging and dangerous nuclear arms race and so on. But I had, at the time that I was thinking about coming east from Berkeley, where I'd been a professor for 23 years, I ended up with offers from both MIT and Harvard I had thought, my wife had thought, all my friends had thought I would go to MIT because I had been an undergraduate at MIT, got a master's at MIT, loved the place, didn't know Harvard nearly as well. But in the course of investigating these two possibilities, I met two people here at the Belfer Center. And those two people, although to this day they probably don't know it, changed my mind about where I was going to go. One of them was Steve Miller, and the other was Henry Lee. Both of them immensely knowledgeable about issues I cared a lot about. Steve Miller on security issues and international relations, nuclear issues in particular. Henry Lee on energy questions, which are the two of the main issues that have preoccupied me for all the preceding part of my career, and both terrific people. In the end, my choice about whether to go to MIT or come to Harvard was largely about the combination of the characteristics of the people I would be working with and the opportunity to build on things that I had been working on and was very interested in continuing. And at the time, I was the chairman of CSAC, as noted yesterday. I had chaired the second volume of the 2-volume plutonium study, working very closely with Matt Bunn. We had, Matt and I, run the study for the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology on US collaboration with Russia on nuclear materials protection, control, and accounting. And I was on the verge of starting a major study for PCAST, for the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, on energy technology innovation. And I thought, Belfer Center is a perfect place. I got Steve Miller to work with on international security, I got Henry Lee to work with on energy. We can continue and support the things that I was doing in the government. And of course, the other idea we had is we can recruit Matt Bunn and his wife, Jennifer Weeks, and create a whole program here that would support efforts around nuclear risk reduction, the connection between nuclear risk reduction and the future of nuclear energy, and so on and so forth. And we'll call it managing the atom. And that's really where it came from. It's how I got here instead of going to MIT. The other thing I will say in fairness is that MIT had also offered, as Harvard had a joint appointment, at Harvard, it was here at the Kennedy School and in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. At MIT, it was in the College of Engineering and the Department of Political Science. But the problem with the MIT offer was that they wanted me to do at MIT what I had done for 23 years at Berkeley, which is build an interdisciplinary program where the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. When I went to Berkeley, it was notorious in the energy and environment space as a venue where the whole was less than the sum of the parts. And the chancellor at Berkeley told me when I came on board in 1973, my job was to make a whole greater than the sum. It took a lot of work over 23 years to build that. And MIT wanted me to do the same thing in an equally fractious environment, an environment around security and energy where the place was divided, feuding, and I thought, I don't want to do that again. And in addition, at the time I was spending 130 days a year on the road, 130 days a year away from Berkeley on all these committees. I was chairing 4 National Academy committees. I was on PCAST, and MIT wanted me to stop doing that because they knew that with 130 days a year on the road, I would not be spending enough time bridging the gaps among all these factions. Yeah. Whereas at the Kennedy School, that was field work. You know, being on.
And compared to your colleagues, you're a stick in the mud.
Chairing CSAC, being on PCAST, that's field work. So Harvard looked much better. I came here. We hired Matt and Jenny, and we were off and running. At the same time that we started managing the atom, we started with Henry, the Energy Technology Innovation Project, which under various names continues today. And I'm very glad that I came here and didn't go to MIT.
Thank you. That is a fantastic story. I turn to you, Matt. So you arrived in 1997, continuous creation 1996. And already in the fall of that year, there is MTA hosts a US-Russian interagency meeting on plutonium disposition. And later, you'll also release one of the probably major publications of MTA together with John, which is about security and management of weapons usable nuclear material. Could you tell a little bit about that work that really started here and that introduced also a big component of the MTA work, which is in fact a dialogue with the Russians, a scientific, technical collaboration with the Russians?
So let me start by saying that while today MTA is a very diverse enterprise, we have on this panel 3 American white males. And although I'm a participant in the Gender Champions effort, I decided to go ahead with that because it's an accurate representation of the nuclear world as it existed in 25 years ago. But I'm happy to say, as you saw in the presentation of the Global Research Network that we launched yesterday, that we have a broader range of voices, including more female leadership of Managing the Atom. Although we did have my wife, Jennifer Weeks, as the founding executive director of Managing the Atom long ago. So the work you mentioned really built on work that I had been doing with help from John and with the advice coming from the Belfer Center while I was in government on securing nuclear material and dealing with the excess plutonium from dismantled nuclear weapons that were no longer needed as a result of the Cold War. So I was the study director for a major National Academy of Sciences study that John mentioned on management and disposition of excess weapons plutonium. And that study started with a question from the National Security Council about what do we do with all this plutonium from dismantled nuclear weapons? And when we started looking into it, we were like, whoa, wait a minute. There's this bigger problem involving basically all plutonium and all highly enriched uranium that needs to be secure, it needs to be accounted for. Ultimately, there needs to be transparency and monitoring for these kinds of stockpiles. And so I had then shifted over to the Office of Science and Technology Policy to work on implementing some of the recommendations, including the early days of some of these non-nuclear efforts to lock down nuclear materials. There literally were places with, gaping holes and fences, no detector at all to set off an alarm if somebody's carrying plutonium out in their briefcase. And there were real thefts of real bomb material taking place. And when I was in government, it was not unusual for me to wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh my goodness, the bad guys are going to get the plutonium before we finish getting these security measures in. It's going to be partly my fault. So I was still obsessed with that topic when I arrived at Harvard. And one of the problems the US government had been having in its work with Russia on disposition of the excess plutonium is that in either of our countries, that would involve multiple institutions. It would not just involve the Department of Energy and the Ministry of Atomic Energy. The relevant nuclear regulators would have to be involved. The relevant ministries of defense would have to be involved, and so on. And the United States kept saying to the Russians, let's have a meeting with all of the relevant parties. And the Russians kept showing up with just the Ministry of Atomic Energy. And finally, DOE called me up and said, why doesn't Harvard organize a meeting? Because you can just invite whoever you feel like inviting, and it won't be the Russians deciding who comes to the meeting. And so we organized the first real interagency meeting between the two sides. And it was at that meeting where the US-Russian plutonium disposition agreement was sort of first conceived, and the parallel R&D agreement to sort of develop technologies for it was first conceived, mostly in the hallways rather than in the main sessions.
Which is usually the case,
which is usually the case at such meetings. And then John and I were very much trying to push forward the kinds of ideas that we had been pushing before we got to Harvard about a sort of broad regime for security, accounting, transparency for plutonium and highly enriched uranium, and ultimately sort of management of the nuclear fuel cycle, and did the first major paper on that topic together in 1997, as you mentioned. But that became the subject of security and accounting for nuclear material became sort of a theme of managing atom all the way to the present, where we invented a number of what became important initiatives after building on the Nunn-Lugar work that had been done at the Belfer Center. We came up with the idea of a 4-year effort to lock down all the nuclear material in the world. That was the main thing agreed at the first Nuclear Security Summit. We sort of issued a whole series of what for a while were annual reports about how are we doing on nuclear security around the world, what should be done next. By nuclear security, by the way, many people mean many different things. What I mean is actual security for nuclear facilities, nuclear materials, nuclear weapons, not disarmament, not non-proliferation generally, etc. Similar to the definition that the International Atomic Energy Agency has. So anyway, that became a major theme and has continued to be a major theme today. We've branched into some specifics like protection against insider threats, where I did a book with Scott Sagan a couple of years ago. And more broadly, the management of the nuclear fuel cycle has also been a major theme for managing the atom because it's a key element of where nuclear energy issues and nuclear weapons issues intersect.
Can I offer one addendum, which I think is very important and which a lot of people working in this space today, if they ever knew it, have forgotten. And that is, at the time we were doing this in the early to mid 1990s, there was a very widespread impression among decision makers and people who weren't actually weapons scientists that reactor grade, so-called reactor grade plutonium could not be used in nuclear weapons because of its very high neutron background, which would cause what in the trade is called pre-initiation, that the chain reaction would start too soon and the thing would fizzle. We who had actual Q clearances and contact with the US weapons program knew, since I started in that business in 1970, knew that that was not true. We knew that weapon grade plutonium, reactor grade plutonium, plutonium at any composition other than pure U-238 could be used in nuclear weapons, and with suitable sophistication could be used in advanced nuclear weapons. But it was very hard to get that message across because the key insights were classified. And one of the things that happened in the study that we conducted at the National Academy with Matt as the executive director was we had a bunch of people on that panel who knew the technical facts. And we declared in the report that plutonium at any composition could be used in nuclear weapons. We were prevented from saying something that Matt was actually instrumental in getting declassified in 1998, much later, which was reactor grade plutonium can be used in nuclear weapons at any level of sophistication. We weren't allowed to say that. And we had a huge struggle even to be able to say that it could be used.
Basically, at any level of sophistication that you can make, that you could make a bomb with weapons grade plutonium. Obviously, it's not that easy to make a bomb from plutonium, period. But if you can do it with weapon grade, you can do it with
But this
reactor
was
grade.
huge at the time because one of the most important and at the same time controversial conclusions of the work that we did in the Academy study, the work we did with the Russians, was that the plutonium in the nuclear fuel cycle has to be protected as carefully and as rigorously as plutonium in the weapons program. The Russians, by the way, hated that result because the Russians wanted to recycle plutonium on a large scale in their commercial reactor program. And indeed, the one recommendation that we made in the CSAC report that the Russians would not accept when we were working with Velikov and a counterpart team of Russians in the report to the two presidents, to Clinton and Yeltsin, they would not accept the notion that you had to protect the plutonium in the commercial fuel cycle to the same degree as you would actually protect intact nuclear weapons. Our argument was that plutonium separated is so close to being a nuclear weapon in the modern world, where the so-called secrets have long since been out, so close to being a nuclear weapon that it should be protected as if it were a nuclear weapon. And the Russians did not dispute the technical conclusion in this committee. They said, we simply cannot agree to that because it would make our nuclear reactor recycling program impractical. It would cost so much to protect recycled plutonium in the nuclear fuel cycle to the extent that one was considering it equivalent to a nuclear weapon, that whole system would not work.
We argued the system was impractical to start with.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I've been arguing, by the way, since 1973, that large-scale recycle of plutonium was both very dangerous and economically unattractive, and also unnecessary.
And actually, one of the most highly cited publications of managing atom is a report on the economics of recycling plutonium from 2003.
I want to switch to.
I just wanted to add one small point here.
You guys are the most
which is
undisciplined.
We are.
We had,
This reflects how
Totally.
managing atom has actually been managed over the last 25 years.
the sausage is being made in front of your eyes. So we had a longstanding collaboration with colleagues in Japan, headed by a man named Ambassador Ryokichi Imai, in which a cluster of Japanese experts displayed a permanent inability to understand everything that John just said.
All right.
Again, because they want.
Can I
inability,
switch to another
unwillingness.
topic? Okay. I think there is another topic we need to put on the table. And in the meantime, I want to encourage people, if I have questions to raise, I have a few topics I would like to discuss with you guys. And another is the gigantic work that you guys have done on nuclear proliferation. Iran, the linkages to nuclear energy. So let's start with Iran in particular. 2006, you come out with this very interesting, concept of cold standby, warm standby of Iranian centrifuges. You publish a bunch of work on the proliferation risk from the Iran nuclear program. Then you guys get access to a very important material, the Israeli archive.
Oh, that's a lot later. Yeah,
That is
right,
a lot later.
right.
So how would you characterize the work that you guys have done in this field? The contribution MTA has done with the Iran primer, for example, you came out very early, explained the JCPOA point by point, but also the working groups that you led. So Steve, let me start with you.
Well, the Iran issue has been on the agenda almost the entire history of managing the atom. And it loomed large in the Clinton administration. And, there was a famous Russian-Iranian deal in, was it 95 or 96, which had a hidden codicil, which involved the provision of an enrichment facility, just later revealed. So the Iran issue has been kind of a permanent feature of the landscape the whole time, as has been North Korea. So, if you're doing non-proliferation, North Korea and Iran are kind of inescapable subjects. I think early on, Matt and I were two of the relatively few people who were advocating some sort of diplomatic solution.
And in particular, compromise with the Iranians.
Right. And the US government was for a very long time starting with the proposition that step one was Iran had to surrender and completely eliminate all of its nuclear program, with the possible exception of the Bushehr reactor. And then we would talk to them. And in the meantime, the main lever was sanctions. And the problem was that hadn't worked, wasn't working, and never has worked.
And still isn't working.
Right.
And had very
Right.
little prospect of work.
Right. On the other hand, we've only given it a quarter of a century, so you know. So our friend Emily Landau used to say, it's always the next tranche of sanctions that's going to be the magic one that solves the problem. But I remember a meeting that Matt and I attended in New York at the Council on Foreign Relations, where we made this argument for diplomacy and compromise, and we were like almost hounded out of the room because
The chair of the meeting joked, he said, because we were being attacked by Europeans, but who were more hardline than we were. And the chair said, we had the usual dynamic between American appeasers and European hardliners.
yeah, well, the explanation for that is the Iranians were very tough negotiators, and they routinely infuriated the British and French negotiators with their stubbornness and their own refusal to budge. But I've had the opportunity over a very long sweep of time to be involved in several protracted track 1.5, track 2 exercises with Iran, in the course of which I've gotten to know a number of their people and have somewhat fuller appreciation of their perspective, although much of it is not shareable, but it's worth understanding. You know, there's a general context, which is this is a society that feels under siege. They believe that they're, you know, at the top of the target list for the world's leading military power, the United States, and the region's leading military power, Israel. They have no allies or friends to speak of, with possible exception of Bashar al-Assad, who's at best a mixed blessing. So the facts seem to be that up until about 2003, Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapon, or at least taking the steps that gave them a weapons option. Since 2003, they seem to have stepped back from that mostly, although there's some gray zone activities that can be construed in a more alarming way. And basically, despite the confident judgments of many of the skeptics on our side, including our friend Jerry Seymour, that no deal would ever be possible with Iran because they legitimize themselves by virtue of anti-Americanism, and the supreme leader, who's the only one who really counts, was unalterably opposed to an agreement, so on. When we tried diplomacy, we actually did get an agreement. The problem is the agreement only got 2 or 3 years, as opposed to the 25 years the sanctions have gotten,
Right.
in order to see if it might work. And they never had long enough to take root, because the key actors were really private sector players who had to see the deal persist long enough that they would be confident in investing their money and their resources into economic activity with Iran. So Iran saw relatively little benefit, and they were complaining about it even under Obama. But of course, Trump came in and severed it. So I think we're on the verge now of losing the JCPOA, and we're going to have to recur to managing this problem without an agreement. And the effect of that has been to bring Iran back to an edge of being able to weaponize if and when they make that decision. I think the cost to them of actual weaponization would be extremely high, including the possible provoking of preventive military action by one or multiple parties. And so I don't think it's absolutely certain that they will go that route, but I've long harbored the thought that maybe the best way to persuade Iran that they don't need nuclear weapons is not to threaten them with military attack. So it's just a thought that occurred to me.
It just crossed your mind.
Yeah. But I mean, why don't you add?
So I want to take it in a slightly different direction and talk about it's not just the publications and the meetings, it's the people that are a key product of managing Atom. And part of what we've done on the Iran topic, we've had a series of Iranian scholars come and be fellows at Managing Atom, as well as, for example, Israeli scholars. One of my favorite years of Managing the Atom, we had a former deputy foreign minister of Iran, a former official of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, and a former aide to President Musharraf of Pakistan in the group at the same time. Now, as you might imagine, Managing Atom is not a place where you have one point of view. Everybody has their academic freedom and not everybody agrees on the same thing. But we have some very lively dialogues. And we've had, from the beginning, Managing Atom has been conceived as both interdisciplinary and international, to bring sort of different ideas from different disciplines and different countries together. And I think when these people go back to Iran, to Russia, to China, we've been able to maintain important connections. I believe we'll be hearing a video from a former Managing Atom fellow who's now Israel's ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency later. And I think that the insights that they gain at Managing Atom have affected the way that they think about these problems subsequently, and that people are an important part of our product, and relationships are an important part of our product. So in my view, we're coming up with ideas. We're also training the next generation and sort of building a network of people with some shared ideas about how to make the nuclear world a safer place.
Let me just reinforce that briefly. There's a very important point there, and that is that understanding the positions and the views of people on the other side is immensely important. That's one of the great values of the kinds of interactions we've been talking about now for a couple of days. I mean, the idea that you only need to understand your own position and can simply argue from that effectively is just nonsense in these kinds of interactions. In the years I've sat on PhD committees, I almost always ask the candidate to defend the opposite position, whatever they're working on. You better be able to defend the opposite position. You better understand it well enough that you can defend it. And that has so often proven to be the key to getting agreements. I think it was very important in the Iran negotiations that Ernie Moniz and his Iranian counterpart had in common a background in nuclear energy, nuclear physics, and a degree of mutual respect that enabled them to understand the other's position. And they used that to help advance that negotiation.
John, could I pick up on this? I have a specific question for you. So as climate change becomes such an important topic and concern, we have had increasingly more MTA applicants, fellows, who really would like to come here and study the interface between environment and nuclear energy. And this requires also, I think, a new kind of training for people that come with the science background, the scientific background, and need to understand the policy. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think this interaction, the climate change and nuclear energy topic, will change also the way in which MTA maybe train people?
The first thing I would say is you're absolutely right that people who come with science training need to understand the policy. People who come with policy training need to understand the science. And that symmetry has been a fundamental pillar of things that I've tried to do and that Managing the Atom has tried to do over the years. I mean, it's always possible, given smart people and good mentors and instructors for them to work with, to surmount that barrier and get people from a policy background to develop an adequate understanding of the science for the purposes of their policy work, and similarly to get scientists to get an adequate understanding of the policy to be effective in working with policymakers. I'm not suggesting that you can make somebody a total hybrid and be as strong in both domains, but you can get people to the point where they can work effectively across the boundary. In terms of the intersection of nuclear energy and climate, it is, I think, a reality that the climate issue has given nuclear energy a new lease on life in a number of countries around the world where it was thought to be dead or dying. Whether that ultimately will prove justified is an open question. I mean, my own argument about climate change and nuclear energy is the climate change problem will be easier to solve if we can get a substantial contribution from nuclear energy. Doesn't mean that we won't be able to address it without that, but it would be a lot easier to address if we had that. But nuclear energy has to solve 4 big problems in order to be able to play that role on a global basis. Economics is currently too expensive. Safety, while we make it cheaper, we have to make it safer at the same time. Waste disposal, which has to be done in a way that's acceptable to the public as well as acceptable to the technical community. And finally, proliferation. Doesn't matter in the United States, we already have more nuclear weapons than any sensible person would want. Excuse me for expressing a personal view there that everybody may not agree with. But obviously, proliferation is not an issue for expanding nuclear energy in the United States, except insofar as if we decided to do it by recycling plutonium, subnational groups might get it and indeed transfer it to other nations as well as potentially use it themselves. But proliferation is a big problem. If you want to expand nuclear energy in lots of countries that don't have nuclear weapons, you then really have to figure out how to break the link. I believe that all 4 of those problems are technically solvable, technically manageable, except for the last, which needs a huge component of political engagement to be successfully addressed. And again, I believe that political engagement is possible in principle, but the question is, are we going to be wise enough and smart enough to get it done? I think that's a great topic for people in managing the atom. The various pieces of that problem are things that we've long been working on. We have lots of people who know about them. We get terribly interesting fellows whose interactions on those topics are very valuable. So I think it's a great one. And of course, it's helpful if the folks who are doing that know something about the climate issue, but they don't need to know a whole lot. I mean, I sometimes say that, and I won't bore you here, but there are 5 things about the climate issue that everybody can understand that are true beyond any reasonable doubt, and that are enough to know what we need to do. And that all these details that people argue about, where you need a PhD in atmospheric science to really understand the argument, don't matter from the standpoint of what the world needs to be doing now. And I would say when people come here to look at the intersection between climate change and nuclear energy, come to Managing the Atom Project, most of their effort is going to be on these elements of nuclear energy that have to be addressed if nuclear is to make the contribution to climate change that we'd like.
Let me just add a couple of, one point on nuclear energy and then a point on people and scientists and so on. On nuclear energy, I think when John says safety, he means safety and security, because a major nuclear release could be caused by terrorist action as well as just by accident. On the people, I just wanted to offer some examples of success. I mean, we saw the video from Alison McFarland. Alison McFarland was a geologist when she came to Managing the Atom and sort of absorbed a policy perspective while she was here and ended up as chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, admittedly with quite a few steps in between Managing the Atom and the chairmanship. At one point, we took a fellow by the name of Matt Sharp, who was a theoretical physicist who had never worked on policy at all, but colleagues of ours said was a really smart and interesting guy, and that turned out to be correct. And he absorbed policy things and went off to be the U.S. expert on IAEA safeguards at the U.S. mission to the IAEA. The David Nusbaum was a nuclear engineer from Israel who played a senior role at the Dimona nuclear site, and came and thought about policy for a couple of years at Managing Atom, and is now the Israeli ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency. So I think one of the important roles Managing Atom has played has been in exactly the integration of political scientists, engineers, physicists, lawyers, people from different disciplines, from different countries, who are able to pick up a little bit of understanding of the other's perspective, and then go out into the world with that more integrated understanding.
We have questions. I have also lots of questions remaining, but Matt, let me turn to the audience.
So Douglas Shaw says, thank you for this outstanding discussion of a singular program, and then asks, the assertion of the direct usability of reactor-grade plutonium for nuclear weapons generated pushback for years after this fact was declassified. Has the declassification had an appropriate effect on policy discourse around future commercial reprocessing?
It's had a substantial effect, but in my view, still not an adequate one. And I will tell you one more story about this that I've been itching to tell. And it has to do.
Thank you, Doug.
We've talked about the intransigence of Japanese officials on this question, and mentioned just in passing, I think that French officials have also been very intransigent. And here's the story. After we did the plutonium study in the academy, members of our committee briefed it to all kinds of different people nationally and internationally that they knew. And Dick Garwin, whom we mentioned multiple times yesterday, had very good contacts in France. And so he briefed the report to the chairman of the French Atomic Energy Commission. And the chairman of the French Atomic Energy Commission told him that this argument that reactor-grade plutonium can be used in nuclear weapons is just crazy. It's absolutely wrong. So Garwin said, I want you to talk to your nuclear weapon designers. Talk to the French nuclear weapon designers about that question. And then you and I will meet again in a month. So Garwin comes back in a month and he meets with the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission of France again. And the chairman, Dick, says, all right, what did your scientists say? And the chairman said, we agree with you, but it is not the position of the French government to say so publicly.
I am fond of
that underscores the inadequacy of this effort.
I am fond of a quote from a old leftist who ran for governor and was beaten in California, who said, the hardest thing in the world is convince a man to believe something that his salary depends on his not believing.
Doug, thank you for the great question.
And then Nick Roth asks, between Russia, North Korea, and Iran, among others, it's easy to be pessimistic. What makes you hopeful about the future of nuclear risk reduction? Where do you hope the world will be when MTA turns 50?
Ooh.
In the same orbit.
Well, I'm hopeful that I will. I'm thinking I will probably be in the ground at that point. But
Is that optimistic?
So one of the things that makes me optimistic is past success. Over the years, again and again, people at Managing Atom have come up with interesting ideas, have managed to convince governments to actually adopt them and seen them make the world a safer place. And that's one of the most satisfying things. Now, on the other hand, we are, as a nuclear world, in a very dark place right now. I commend to everyone a interview that Sig Hecker has in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist currently, in which he argues that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has upended the whole global nuclear order. And I do think it has to affect how we think about practically everything that Managing Atom works on. It has to affect how we think about nuclear deterrence and the role of both nuclear and conventional weapons and how those interact in our world. It has to affect how we think about the future of arms control. The arms control talks, the strategic stability talks with Russia are completely on hold right now. It'd be very difficult to ratify with 2/3 in the Senate, a treaty with Russia at this point. It has to affect how we think about nuclear energy, in part because while people were sort of aware in the back of their minds, yes, there could be wars where there are nuclear power plants. Now we've had this vivid demonstration that's reminding us that there could be wars where there are nuclear power plants. It has to, by the same token, affect how we think about nuclear safety and nuclear security. It is definitely affecting how we think about non-proliferation. I think a number of countries are now looking again at, do we actually maybe need nuclear weapons for our own security? So I think there's a big agenda. I am very hopeful that people at Managing Atom will continue to contribute new ideas for addressing these very large challenges. So while we are in a dark place, I'm hopeful we'll keep coming up with some ideas and that at least some of those ideas will get adopted and make a difference.
I want to return to one aspect of the previous question about the effectiveness of revealing that plutonium at any level of contamination with unattractive isotopes can be used. And that is the difficulty in making that conclusion stick in terms of right up the line of policymakers to the top is in part the old dilemma about classified information. The detailed reasons that reactor grade plutonium is usable at all weapons of sophistication are still classified, and for good reason. That is, it is quite clearly not in the interest of the world to have those insights propagated into the hands of proliferating countries, proliferating groups. And at the same time, not being able to explain to people why it is true generates skepticism. And this leads to the following conclusion. We will continue to need people at all levels of the debate who have access to classified information. There are a lot of very energetic, very smart young people who say, I do not want to be contaminated with classified information, and who turn down opportunities to take positions that would require them to get clearances. I have advised my students for years, if you have an opportunity to work in a domain where you need a clearance, I think you should take it. The fact that I had clearances from 1970 on was instrumental in getting me into discussions that I could not even participate in if I hadn't had the clearances. I used to be the only person in California who could debate Edward Teller on television or radio, which I did often, because every other qualified person, including Dick Garwin, Herb York, Sid Drell, had at one time or another called him a liar in one of these debates. And once you called Edward Teller a liar, he would never debate you again. And so what I could do in the debate, rather than calling him a liar, I would say, Edward, I have the same clearance as you do, and I disagree with you.
John, can I ask you, what makes you optimistic?
The thing that makes me most optimistic is young people. We are seeing in this program and in other programs on this general topic around the country and indeed around the world, a lot of really smart younger people who are determined to have an impact on these challenges. And my optimism is largely based on the hope that they will do better than we did.
Let me just jump in on a further elaboration on the plutonium point, because there's a related point that people also disagree with. There's many people who believe, it would be much too hard for terrorists to make a nuclear bomb. Impossible. It takes a Manhattan Project. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Most of the work of the Manhattan Project was about making the nuclear material. If you have access to highly enriched uranium, especially, but also plutonium, unfortunately, study after study by the US government, by other governments in several countries around the world have concluded it is plausible that a substantial terrorist group would be able to make a crude nuclear bomb. Making something that's crude, unsafe, unreliable, unknown yield, fits in the back of a truck is way easier than making something that's safe, secure, efficient, known yield, can be used from a combat aircraft or a ballistic missile.
We are on the note of optimism.
But still, it's a key
refuse-
point managing Adam has been pushing for many years.
I refuse to end this
And-
session
well-
with this.
Well, we have, let me make the point that I believe managing Adam's work has greatly reduced that danger over the last 25 years. If you look at how secure nuclear material is around the world today, compared to what it was 25 years ago, the difference is dramatic. And I think the ideas and proposals that came from managing Adam were one important part in making that difference.
Steve, last word before we close.
And I'm supposed to be optimistic.
Optimism.
The orbit, the orbit.
You're exactly.
Well, as Matt says, we sit at a dark moment, but as some of you have heard me say before, in my sort of career-long nuclear quantum, it's noticeable that some of the greatest leaps forward in arms control and restraint have happened after we've come face to face with some of our worst fears. And sometimes it takes an encounter with the dangers to concentrate the mind on moving forward with some areas of prudential restraint. So maybe there's a silver lining to the current dark moment. A second observation is we live in our own little universe here, and our own little universe is American policy and Trump and the collapse of all the arms control infrastructure that has governed US behavior with the other major nuclear powers. But there are other countervailing forces out there in the world, right? And whatever one thinks about the specific contents of the TPNW, the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons, the fact is that it was signed and is now ratified and in legal force. And it has attracted the signatures of 120 something states. And so there are forces and factors out there that are working the other direction. And part of that, I think, reflects what I would call backlash effects. So we have an absence of arms control leadership from some of the usual suspects. But the Dutch government has now launched an initiative asking the question, how can we help fill the leadership void in arms control? What can we do, right? I'm on the fringes of a group in Europe that's asking the question, what do we envision for the next phase of the European arms control architecture, now that the one that we thought existed has been shattered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And so people are now thinking about a whole family of issues. Some of what comes up in discussion sounds quite familiar, like rediscovering the INF agreement and figuring out some way to have a follow-on to the CFE agreement, but some of it also falls more in the risk reduction area. But the point is that there are effects of the corrosion that cut in the other direction, the corrosion of arms control, where people grow concerned. They don't want to live in an unconstrained world. They feel more comfortable in a nuclear universe that has some guidelines and guardrails. And there is a cadre of people who have invested decades of efforts in promoting an array of normative preferences. Go look at the 10 principles for European security that are contained in the Helsinki document of 1975. That's the world that Europe thought existed. Putin has violated at least 9 of the 10. Arguably, he's got a perfect score. But there's a whole community of human beings in Europe who are committed to those principles and who believe that there needs to be some sort of effort to encourage a restoration and are asking the question, where are we going to be when this war ends and what can we do to move things in a constructive direction? So those are kind of little germs of optimism that I see, but you have to take the long view, right? As nothing's going to happen now and nothing's going to happen soon. But would it be surprising if 3 to 5 years from now there's a follow-on to START or some sort of agreement on INF that includes the Chinese or whatever? I mean, a lot of these things that seemed impossible in the past happened. Go back and look in the 80s at the idea of the zero option for INF. People thought this was preposterous. This was utterly impossible. There was no way the Soviets would ever accept it. And if they did, we weren't interested in it, right? And then in 1987, you get the INF. So a lot of things have happened that have surprised us. A lot of things have happened that were thought to be impossible. And a lot of these things have happened after dark periods.
Wow, what an incredible closure. So I want to thank you all for attending this session. We will resume soon, but before, I would like to play another video.
I had the privilege to join the MTA as a research fellow in 2011. After many years in the Israel Atomic Energy Commission, the 2 years in Belfer, next to precious friend Professor Martin Mallin, paved my way towards the diplomatic world and gave me a unique opportunity to explore and combine between technology and nuclear policy worlds, to be exposed to diverse thoughts and ideas on how to cope with relevant topics in order to live in a more secure, safe, and better world.
I want to thank John Holdren, Steve Miller, and Matt Bunn, not only for being here today, but for the work that you have done for so many decades to keep this world safer. And you haven't done a good job, guys, but I hope you will stay with us for the next 25 years and remedy what you have done. But again, thank you so much for your work, guys. This was really fantastic conversation for me. So thank you.
ourselves back to order, and we now have a panel on the implications of the Ukraine war. As we all understand, on February 24th, with the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a sense in which we entered a different world. The Europe that we thought existed was shown not to exist. The Europe whole and free, the Europe that had Russia as a strategic partner, the Europe in which the use of force was thought to be unthinkable and a vestige of the past. That Europe is no more. As this obviously has wide implications in terms of our relations with Russia, the future of European security, and so on. It also, as Matt Bunn suggested this morning, it has huge implications for the global nuclear order and for pretty much all of the subjects that interest us in managing the atom. We have a panel of 4 speakers who are going to share their thoughts on the implications of the Ukraine war. I believe that 2 are joining us on the screen. Yes, I can see you. Hard to see with the back of my head, but there they are. And I believe we're going to start with our colleague Mariana Budjarin, who's joining us from Reykjavik, I believe. So Mariana, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you all so much. And I'm very, very sorry I cannot be with you there in person in my home institutions at MTA to join the celebrations. But I'm here in Reykjavik trying to figure creative ways to not let arms control die, which, as I will discuss, is probably one of the risks and one of the implications of the war in Ukraine. So when I think of nuclear order, I rely actually on the work of William Walker, a British international relations scholar and theorist that helpfully imagines as a combination and an intersection of 2 systems that sometimes complement each other and sometimes are in tension, sometimes are in contradiction with each other. And one is the system of nuclear deterrence, the system that emerged, intellectually first in the U.S. Defense intellectual circles soon after the end of World War II, and has mostly solidified in a bilateral U.S. Soviet context following, during the Cold War. This concept and practice and the system, the relationships of nuclear deterrence have become an integral part of national security postures of nuclear possessors, those in, that are part of the NPT, the nuclear 5 under the NPT, but also the states that have acquired nuclear weapons since outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the other system is as he calls, a system of nuclear abstinence, right? The non-proliferation system, as it were. And it emerged somewhat later based on the understanding that, the more nuclear possessors in the world, the more nuclear states in the world, the more nuclear weapons in the world, the greater the risk that something will go wrong, the greater the risk of nuclear war. And as we know it, I'm not going to give a big historical tour, but this system solidified around key international institutions, including the NPT and the IAEA. And NPT in particular, it rests on a number of bargains, of key bargains that make a compromise between nuclear possessors and all others that relinquish their right to possess nuclear weapons by joining this treaty. Make that compromise sustainable and possible. Ultimately, the entire system, as I mentioned, this system of nuclear abstinence, as it were, rests on the premise that the fewer nuclear possessors and the fewer nuclear weapons in the world, the better for everybody in the international system, the better for international security. As I said, these 2 subsystems emerged almost in parallel, in conjunction with each other. And in some instances, like the relationship between extending deterrence to the allies of the to nuclear superpowers and nuclear nonproliferation, they are complementary, right? Because it has been understood that by providing extended deterrence to some of the key allies, the superpowers have discouraged them to pursue their own nuclear deterrent. But in other aspects, in other instances, these two systems are rife with tensions. And one such instance is the meaning of arms control. So within the deterrence framework, arms control aims for crisis stability and arms race stability, where numerical reductions as such may or may not be part of arms control arrangements, right? They're means, they're not the ends. While in the abstinence framework, arms control is exactly the core part of the bargain that entails gradual numerical reductions that ultimately lead to zero at some unspecified future, as recorded in Article 6 of the NPT. So for some three decades ago, many of us enjoyed this or entertained this glimmer of hope that perhaps with the end of the Cold War, the system of deterrence will shrink and become less relevant, and somehow complete nuclear disarmament might be possible. For a number of reasons, this did not come to fruition. And instead, the tensions between and within these two systems of the international nuclear order have been manifesting themselves. And these tensions have existed there well before the war in Ukraine. For instance, ambitious strategic modernization programs of all nuclear possessors and perceived lack of arms reduction deepened the antagonism between the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots, a process that ultimately resulted in the adoption of TPNW, the so-called Ban Treaty in 2017. Turning now to the war in Ukraine, and its consequences for the nuclear order, it is difficult to see how Russia's invasion of Ukraine would mitigate rather than exacerbate these tensions. For the system of deterrence, we saw Russia using the nuclear card very early in the crisis, right at the launch of the invasion, in President Putin's speech inaugurating the invasion. And also, 4 days into the war, the raising of the nuclear alert level, which might not have been the raising of, the way we understand it, the raising of a nuclear alert level per se. It was the raising of battle readiness. But still, it is a very clear signaling to the United States and NATO to deter the alliance from getting directly involved in the war on Ukraine's behalf, on Ukraine's side. And it worked, and it works. We learned that nuclear deterrence works that way, that nuclear powers will be very cautious in engaging with each other directly, even if, that means not standing up for something that's very clearly is a just war of defense, right, by a state in the international system. So it seems that nuclear deterrence will remain the mainstay of many of national security doctrines where it's already ingrained. The war will also likely put greater demands on US extended deterrence in Europe as well as in East Asia. Russia, through the prosecution of this war, revealed its conventional weaknesses. And it is not a stretch to assume that perhaps that will motivate it rather to rely to a greater measure on nuclear weapons in the future. We're also increasingly thinking about the risk, not of failure of deterrence between two nuclear armed adversaries, such as Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States, but of nuclear use by Russia against a non-nuclear state, Ukraine, in a punishing coercive strike aimed at terminating the costly war on Russia's terms. While I still think that such a risk remains very small, it is greater than we thought it was, just 2.5 months ago. And all of that will have bearing on the way the value of nuclear weapons is understood within the international order. For the system of non-proliferation, for the system of abstinence, so to say, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine undermines the credibility of the nuclear non-proliferation regime by eroding some of its key bargains, not least because Ukraine did inherit part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal in 1991 and did make a decision to surrender this arsenal in 1994 and join the NPT in exchange for a deal that included security assurances from nuclear weapon states. These security assurances were just glibly violated by one of the assurers, a nuclear state, Russia. Of course, we know that Ukraine's nuclear story is more nuanced. As scholars and as practitioners in this field, we understand that what Ukraine gave up was not a fully fledged and usable nuclear deterrent. However, the optics of the Ukraine nuclear story are rather unfortunate for the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and the value of nuclear assurances as a tool of non-proliferation is likely radically eroded. The lesson for the world, the lesson that is very easy to make for the whole wide world to see, is that nuclear disarmament does not pay, right? It may not provide for your security. The war in Ukraine also made the already dim prospects of successful US-Russian strategic arms control, in particular, as it is understood within the system of abstinence in terms of reductions, even dimmer. This will likely exacerbate the tensions that already exist between the nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots over the lack of progress in arms control and over increased reliance on by nuclear states on nuclear deterrence. So unfortunately, I do not have many good forecasts and predictions. This is, however, to say that much is riding on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. We don't know how it's going to end. And one can only hope that that what we learn from it is perhaps in a very hopeful way that nuclear weapons may be irrelevant to the prosecution of conventional campaigns. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Mariana. Hope you are having a good time in Reykjavik. We turn next to our friend Nick Roth. Nick was for many years a member of the team here. He was Mariana's predecessor. He left us to go down to DC and join the Stimson Center. He's since moved on to the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Nick, you and I are more commonly swapping restaurant suggestions, but today we look forward to hearing from you about your impressions of the implications of the Ukraine war.
Thank you, Steve. And you just reminded me that I'm going to Italy later this year, and I need to ask you about that trip.
It's another MTA theme, actually.
It's really a pleasure to be part of this celebration and this discussion. I can't think of a better group and moment to be talking about such a critical aspect of nuclear risks around the world right now. I'm going to focus more so on the nuclear security situation in Ukraine. Nuclear security, using the definition that Matt laid out earlier, as opposed to some of the others that have been used. To start, the situation that we're seeing in Ukraine is unprecedented. There has never been a full-scale war in a country with such a robust nuclear infrastructure. And while we don't know, I mean, there are a lot of unknowns about what is happening on the ground there. The evidence that we're seeing points to significantly degraded security, safety, and emergency response at nuclear facilities around the country. We've seen an attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, really shocking images of a full-scale assault on that facility that is occupied to this day by Russia. and certainly some concerning signs about the nuclear security and safety situation there. We saw the attack and occupation of the Chernobyl site, which Russia recently vacated, and some really harrowing and again disturbing stories of what the people on the ground went through, the staff at that facility, and the shelling of the neutron source center in Kharkiv, another example of Russia's assault on nuclear facilities in Ukraine. And while the worst case scenarios and disaster was averted during these assaults, there are really significant implications for nuclear security around the world. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those. The first that I wanted to start with is that we're really seeing a new and unprecedented role for the International Atomic Energy Agency in Ukraine in a number of different ways. First, the agency has really been serving as an arbiter of truth for safety and security on the ground in Ukraine. It's been providing almost daily updates on nuclear safety and security and safeguards in Ukraine. It's noteworthy that actually it's now been 5 days since they provided their last update. This is the longest they've gone without providing such an update since the war began. But these reports and actually a more thorough report that they released last week have really provided essential information about the conditions on the ground and some really disturbing details. I would recommend the longer report to all of you to get an understanding of what's going on there. The other way that the IAEA has been serving an important role is through its technical assistance by offering experts, by offering equipment, and there was just a recent mission to Ukraine by the IAEA to Chernobyl to start the process of providing technical assistance to nuclear facilities. Part of that role has been Director General Grossi's political leadership. He has reportedly voiced concern about nuclear safety and nuclear security in Ukraine. He's referred to the situation as unsustainable and called for very specific measures to reduce risk. I think it's worth noting that while this role is really important and these messages coming from the IAEA are very helpful, what the IAEA hasn't called for is the withdrawal of troops from Ukraine. And while they are playing an important role, it sort of highlights the limitations that institutions like this are under just because of the way they're structured. But this really sets a new precedent for how the IAEA might engage in the future during times of crisis, during times of war, particularly as we think about a future possibly with more nuclear reactors, smaller nuclear reactors in countries that may face risks or risks of war or other crises. Another way that I think the Ukraine really changes, it impacts nuclear security around the world is really in how we think about nuclear security. Nuclear security has primarily been focused on non-state actors. This has to do with its evolution during the 1990s and as a response to the September 11th attacks. We now have to think about a world where states could openly attack each other's nuclear facilities. It's worth pointing out that while this is a new consideration at the forefront of our thinking, it's really something we should have been thinking about for a long time. There have been numerous cases throughout history, including recent history, where states have attacked nuclear facilities. So it's worth, I think the best way to describe it is what we're seeing, while new, is much more evolutionary than revolutionary. But it means that we need to think about a world not just where countries can improve each other's nuclear security, but actively try to undermine it and how we respond to that condition. We also need to think about how countries and not just nuclear facilities need to respond to threats to nuclear facilities. There's a certain, nuclear facilities are designed to protect against a certain range of threats, and the state is supposed to step in when the threat exceeds that design. There hasn't been a lot of focus on how whole countries would respond to some of those threats. And this has importance not just for the types of wars we're seeing, but also with some of the emerging technologies we're seeing coming down and their impact on nuclear security. The war in Ukraine also, and this is related to this previous point, also highlights the need for greater focus on maintaining nuclear safety and security during times of crisis. And obviously, what we're seeing in Ukraine is one example, but there have been many over the decades pointing to the need for greater focus on this. Wildfires, the Fukushima crisis. The IAEA is playing an important role here in helping Ukraine sort of weather this crisis. For example, the IAEA, Ukraine has requested that the IAEA send additional diesel generators to support nuclear facilities around the country. But really spending more time in thinking not just when these really dramatic events happen, but how to weather crises like COVID-19, these extended crises where nuclear facilities still need to be able to operate both safely and securely. The crisis in Ukraine also demonstrates the need for strengthening norms and legal frameworks against targeting of nuclear facilities. We're not starting from scratch here. There's already been important actions taken on this front in a number of different venues. India and Pakistan have an agreement where they have committed not to attack each other's nuclear facilities, where they exchange locations of their civilian facilities. The IAEA General Conference endorsed a statement prohibiting attacks on nuclear installations. Attacking of nuclear facilities is prohibited by the Geneva Protocol, if not the letter of the law, certainly the spirit of the law. So seeing a reaffirmation, new statements, maybe new agreements prohibiting the targeting and attack of nuclear facilities, should be an important response to what we're seeing in Ukraine. And one last thing that I want to emphasize is what we're seeing in Ukraine also highlights the importance of the efforts over the last 3 decades to strengthen nuclear security around the world. Up until the Obama administration, there was more than 100 kilograms of highly enriched uranium in Ukraine. In Kharkiv, the facility that was attacked, there's a very plausible scenario that if not for the efforts to remove that material, we could have been dealing with a situation where there was not just a war in a country with many nuclear reactors, but also where there was nuclear weapons usable material. And I'm going to end on a on sort of a depressing note, and I apologize, but it can still potentially get worse. And I don't think we should lose focus on the fact that this crisis is still ongoing. There hasn't been a major radiological release. And if there were to be one, it would have massive humanitarian, economic, and political impacts. Not to mention, it would really threaten the future, any future role that nuclear power could play as a tool for battling climate change. The single most important thing that can happen to prevent this type of outcome would be for Russia to cease any operations that could pose a threat to nuclear facilities and withdraw its troops and personnel from any nuclear facilities where they are right now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Very interesting set of remarks. One would never guess that he spent years working with Matt Bunn. Next on the agenda is our colleague, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you all. Marina and I are going to present some of the initial findings of an article that we were commissioned, and so we really would love to hear your feedback and also maybe data points that we don't have yet to build on the current findings. So the question that was given to us, and the paper is now under review, was a simple one, or it seemed simple. How will the Ukraine war and the current sanction regime impact Russia's nuclear industry? And the underlying second question was, given the overdominance of Russia in the nuclear industry market, might China then become a real competitor or potentially exploit the weakening of the Russian nuclear industry? This was a very complicated question. And I have to say, when we think about the global nuclear industry or the nuclear energy market, the very first thing everybody thinks about is the sale of reactors. But there is way more to the story than just selling reactors. There are, in fact, a lot of different parts, something that we would call nuclear infrastructure or nuclear logistics, that go actually into really defining who dominates the market and with what capacities. And so we've basically ventured in trying to provide a more nuanced approach to the question and trying really to tease out some of the aspects where we think that the global nuclear energy industry and nuclear energy market is so intertwined with Russia that it will be very difficult, at least in the short and medium term, to think about others coming to the fore and play the role that Russia currently is playing. So let me say that our main argument is a very simple one. And we believe that the sanction regime will certainly ultimately exact cost from the Russian nuclear industry. But we believe that for three specific reasons, the Russian dominance in the global nuclear energy market would likely endure for some time. And so here are the three reasons we are providing. The first one that we have actually failed to look at for quite some time is what happens in the nuclear fuel energy, the nuclear fuel market. And in there, the US and European over-reliance on Russian nuclear fuel is quite abysmal. And thinking about diversifying the global nuclear energy, the nuclear fuel market today, is an endeavor, an enterprise that will take certainly at least a decade. So this cannot be done in the very short period of time. The second reason we don't believe that the Russians' dominance over the market will decline anytime soon is that most of the countries that have already signed agreements with the Russians are now facing enormous sunk costs should they then disregard the agreement and try to purchase or procure additional agreements from other nuclear suppliers out there. And in particular for nuclear newcomers, these sunk costs actually matter a lot. And Marina is going to talk specifically about a couple of countries that we've looked at, like Hungary and Turkey. And then the third reason is a simple one. No other nuclear supplier today can realistically, in a short period of time, offer the services, the support, the capacity building, and the business model, quite frankly, that Russia can. Now, the big question is, what about China? One of the arguments we are making in the paper is that China might eventually, but right now China is very focused domestically on building its own nuclear industry. And therefore, more of the capacities and the investments that China is making are actually, within the country itself. So let me just speak very briefly about what we have done on the nuclear fuel question. And let me also say that our hope is that we will then continue actually interviewing a few people who are involved in this big question and trying to map out more broadly what are the current vulnerabilities of the global nuclear fuel market today. And I want to start with a simple observation that in August 2021, uranium was sold on the market for roughly $26 a pound. In mid-April this year, it skyrocketed at the highest price it's ever been in the past 10 years, and it reached $65 a pound. Now, the spike in price is attributable to many factors. This can be inflation, this can be speculation, many others, but certainly a large factor is the Ukraine war, and reflects in large part the strategic implications of this war on the nuclear fuel market as it is conceived and designed today. Russia is today the sixth largest producer of uranium worldwide, and in 2021, it produced 7% of the total amount. The number one producer of uranium is a country called Kazakhstan, whose ties with Russia are undeniable. In fact, many analysts have also went on record arguing that Russia might, in fact, be able to disrupt the entire global uranium supply simply by influencing the decisions of Kazakhstan, a country that Russia has helped, particularly during the civil unrest in recent times. And then the third reason why we see this spike in price, particularly on the nuclear fuel market, is certainly uncertainty. And this overall inability for the United States and the European Union to diversify in spite of maybe political will. Now, the Americans and the Europeans face very different dependency on Russian nuclear fuel. For the Americans, the main dependency is on enriched uranium. And according to the US Trade Commission in 2021, the United States purchased around $2 billion worth of enriched uranium on the market. This was 53% higher than what the United States imported in 2017. So the United States is increasing imports from the outside. And the number one importer into the United States was Russia. And we're talking about enriched uranium. The Russians provided 29.6% of enriched uranium that came into the United States. The European Union faces a different type of dependency. The EU has a dependency on natural uranium. Russia is the second largest exporter of natural uranium to the European Union countries after Niger. Most of this natural uranium might come from Kazakhstan, but goes through Russia first. And therefore, the dependence is actually quite striking. Let me make also a third point, that across many of the global nuclear industry enterprises today, the idea of the design or the introduction of these advanced reactors, and we've looked at this quite closely, in particular with our colleague Dan Poneman, many of the advanced reactors today require a very specific type of fuel, the HALEU, that is actually produced almost exclusively in Russia today. In fact, we should say Russia is today the only viable commercial supplier. Centrus Energy Corporation in the United States has become the first and only licensed producer of this fuel. And according to several statements that Centrus has made, they will be able to produce the very first batch of this specific fuel by summer 2022. The CEO of Centrus, who we have interviewed, has said very specifically that a real diversification of the global nuclear fuel market will take, according to him, at least a decade. This has enormous political ramifications, which we have already seen played out very clearly in the Biden administration and within the European Union. Now, the executive order that Biden signed to basically sanction the energy sector of Russia clearly excluded the nuclear energy market. In fact, although we did discuss some potential sanctions over Rosatom goes still untouched. And the executive order also the Biden signed specifically talks about new investments in the energy sector of Russia. This also means that all the agreements the United States has concluded will continue to be honored. There is also nothing that came out of the European Union. In fact, the European Parliament did talk about the possibility of sanctioning nuclear fuel, but many have actually argued that the cost would be absolutely untenable for the nuclear industry of the European Union. And finally, let me also say that there is a clear concern in Washington about this dependency over the nuclear fuel produced in Russia. And just very recently, March 2022, in fact, two senators, Senator Jim Risch and John Manchin, actually introduced a bill, the International Nuclear Energy Act of 2022, that tries to create in the long term this nuclear fuel security initiative that eventually will try to reduce the dependency over Russia provisions. But this is not something that's going to be in the immediate future. And this is something that will continue to tie certainly the US nuclear energy market to Russia for quite some time. I want to turn now to Marina for the other two dimensions we've looked at briefly.
Sure. So I'm mostly going to discuss the three case studies that we're looking at, Slovakia, Hungary, and Turkey, because they illustrate other aspects of what does Russia provide to the energy market. So in Slovakia, for example, they would like to get off of Russian products. They'd like to remove themselves from buying uranium from Russia, but they face a lot of domestic civil society resistance to having uranium mining in the country. So that brings the question, which is, okay, if you want to turn off the imports of your Russian uranium, you have to have a backup. But in many European countries, Slovakia being one of them, there's a lot of resistance. And in fact, there is a law in Slovakia that makes it so that local communities have veto power over whether mining companies come in and mine. So again, that extends the timeline of being able to really take yourself off of Russian imports. The other example I'd like to highlight is Hungary. So Hungary right now has a contract with Rosatom to expand its POX power plant. Currently, it has 2 operating reactors. It would like to move that to 4. And currently, they do have a contract in place. And so it would not come under the executive order that Biden issued, because the executive order focused on new investment, right? So Hungary, this is existing investment. But still, moving forward, first of all, Hungarian leadership has faced a lot of public pressure to cancel the contract and absorb the costs. But this project that Rosatom is providing, these 2 other reactors, are a massive investment undertaking. That would be a lot of cost to absorb. So the question really there is, are you able to move away? And also, you already have technical expertise on the site that was built by Rosatom. You already have 2 reactors. So how easy is it to convert the site to another provider? The case in Turkey is kind of similar to what we see in Hungary, but the case in Turkey at the Akkuyu nuclear power plant is currently under construction. The first reactor is under construction and set to be online by 2023. So it's a very different circumstance than Hungary, but still some lessons learned there at that site. The Akkuyu site also is unique in the sense that for the first time, Russia has employed the build, own, and operate model. Akkuyu is set to be about a $22 billion investment. It's also set to provide about 10% of Turkey's annual electricity needs, just to give a sense for how large this project is, and it's underway. So the question is certainly, well, if Rosatom comes under pressure or Turkey decides for political reasons to cancel those contracts, that's a huge cost to absorb, but it's also potentially a stranded asset. And with Turkey, as I said, there's the build, own, operate model. Russia has provided a lot of the financing to make this power plant possible to be even under construction. And so this is kind of the third wing of what Russia provides, which is the financing structures, which is really unique globally. And so what I can say is there are 2 banks in particular that I've taken a look at, and these 2 banks have provided millions of dollars in financing, and they are currently under sanctions. So even though Rosatom hasn't been sanctioned, some of the financing vehicles have. And one of the banks has even been blacklisted by SWIFT, which is an even further statement. So what I'm really watching for in this situations as they continue to unfold is, can Russia continue to make future contracts? How is the financing going to move forward at the Turkish site? Because that's really going to have serious implications for whether Russia can continue to make this kind of offer. Are these banks going to be fiscally healthy and credible for their next customer? So aside from nuclear fuel, these are sort of the other buckets of what Russia exports in its nuclear energy strategy that personally I'm watching for. And it's going to be some key questions coming up.
Great, thank you very much. So we've had 3 different swipes through the Ukraine problem and its implications for things nuclear. We have a few minutes for questions or comments in the room or on the screen. Any reactions?
I have a question.
Yeah, Angie.
What percentage of the Russian economy does the nuclear energy industry take up, and then how does that compare to the oil industry?
So an exact percentage, I couldn't give you right away, but I would say nuclear energy exports comprise a much smaller percentage of oil and natural gas exports in terms of quantity, but also in terms of dollar amount.
But one of the things that we're thinking about precisely also on this, so the percentage in the economic term is certainly much smaller, but one of the questions, the observations we had, I think, like across multiple sectors, that the Russians have used their nuclear experts as the leverage to build much longer technical cooperation agreements with countries. You have, as Marina said, the deployment of Russian scientists who train, or we've seen also in Vietnam, if you remember, Steve, like, the deployment of the Russian scientists who train Vietnamese nuclear experts. And these contracts are not 5 years, right? These are long contracts. So they lock technical cooperation with Russia for a long, long time, which is slightly different if you think about maybe more opportunistic trading like oil and gas. Gas more difficult, but oil certainly is more opportunistic. So the nuclear energy has been a soft power mechanism for Russia. So what happens now, and whether this will force really a rethinking about the global nuclear energy market, will have, in my view, real implications on the soft power that Russia will exercise in some of these countries.
Matt?
So on that question, I mean, one small indicator you mentioned that the U.S. imports of enriched uranium were 2 billion, of which Russia was about 30%. Whereas, if you think about oil and gas, it's $1 billion a day coming from Europe, at least in broad terms. I think it's a little bit smaller now. But just to add on to your point, in its annual report for 2020, Rosatom reported that it had $138 billion in foreign orders on its order book, including 36 foreign nuclear reactors that it was working on. Now, a bunch of those haven't actually started construction yet, but there isn't any US company that has a tenth of that. And so it really is a very dominant supplier. I did want to ask about the sunk cost issue with respect to Turkey. If Russia is paying for the whole thing, isn't the sunk cost mainly Russia's? I mean, Turkey would be left with
The site.
with the site that's sort of ruined and without the power that it was expecting to get. But isn't the sunk cost mainly Russia's?
I would say so from a financial point of view. But what I can also say is that because Turkey has been planning for this nuclear power plant to come online and feed a lot of its energy needs, I would say in a much broader sense, that would be the largest secondary cost that I would take a look at, which is more, a long-term planning that Turkey had, this large amount of electricity that it was expecting to get indigenously. Okay, now it has to pivot and maybe import more oil and natural gas. And then, of course, they would be left with a site that they don't have the technical expertise to operate or the equipment to operate. So.
Yes, Will.
Thank you all. This has been great. My question is principally for Mariana. Mariana, I love how you laid out that the good and the bad news out of the war in Ukraine is that nuclear deterrence is working. And I'm wondering if it can be bridged to a kind of a different message that I'm hearing out of Washington, where it's a lot of talk about we need new nukes, more, better, bigger, better, faster, more in the nuclear world. And in fact, the lesson that we can get out of this is that maybe not, right? Nuclear deterrence is actually punching well above its weight, again, for better or worse. And I'm wondering how we can maybe switch the narrative, and if you have thoughts around that. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I think you're right. I mean, I'm not a regular in Washington, but from what I hear, I can imagine that every crisis gives an opportunity for different, interests to kind of pull their own way, to lobby for their favorite systems and so forth. I think you're absolutely right. What we see, at least as academics, that actually just the very existence of nuclear weapons somehow influences the risks and the calculation of risks and the level of involvement of a nuclear power in a conflict. And it is in that sense that nuclear deterrence works, and adding more and better and faster weapons will actually not change that much of it. But I wonder, the bad news of that, I think, is the overall greater reliance perhaps on the Russian part, especially on the non-strategic nuclear weapons, of which it has a lot still, even though non-deployed, because, as I mentioned, we have seen kind of just the, not exactly the conventional weakness, but it's, Russian army revealed itself as not being 10 foot tall as we might have assumed. And, it's quite visible if you can follow the prosecution of the conventional campaign. And of course, it has used up, not the majority, but a portion of its conventional arms. So until it can rebuild its conventional arsenal, my worry is that the reliance on nuclear deterrence and a nuclear deterrent will be greater, at least on the Russian part. On the US part, I see the danger of, as I said, of increased extended deterrence demands on US nuclear umbrella. Whether that will translate in adding new systems and new faster systems, I hope not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question for Francesca and Marina on the. So from your talk, it seemed a little bit like the countries which are more opposed to Russia, or like supplying troops like that, are more the ones which are recipients of oil and gas, whereas the ones which are more kind of on the fence or a bit more supportive of Russia are the ones receiving technical cooperation with nuclear. Would that be kind of correct? Would that be misrepresentation?
Well, I'm thinking about, where Rosatom is exporting. I mean, certainly in our cases, we've identified Slovakia, Hungary, and Turkey. But there are numerous others. I'm also thinking of India, for example, where Rosatom has been instrumental in building 2 reactors in southern India. And so that's kind of outside of the scope of the piece we're working on in particular, because we focused on Europe. But I would say that's a case where it might complicate those assumptions.
So, but Rosatom is not providing technical cooperation more in the countries which are more opposed. Well, actually, I guess that's the question. Is it providing technical cooperation more to the Western European countries? And if so, has there been a kind of pushback against that in a way that's different from the kind of continued acceptance of the status quo of the oil and gas? Is there a difference between how countries have reacted to continuing to receive oil and gas and kind of turn down technical cooperation for nuclear issues?
Well, I think it has to do with the countries that can. I mean, so the countries we've looked at that have canceled their cooperations with Rosatom, one is Sweden and one is Finland. Sweden could do it because, well, Sweden made an announcement that said that we're not buying Russian uranium, which was convenient because they weren't doing it to begin with. They already had a diversity of providers. Then in Sweden, or Finland, they had a contract to build a site, but that wasn't underway. What was underway was really initial sketches. And so Finland was facing not necessarily a sanctions impetus to cancel the contract, but what they were facing was mostly a political issue. And so the Finnish government decided to cancel the government licensing portion, which in turn canceled the project. So I would say even though domestically there is a lot of, from different sides, depending on which country you're looking at, has been certainly a lot of pushback, but the actions that we're seeing really depend on individual circumstances, at least from what I've been seeing, but happy to talk to you more about that.
If I could just jump in on that, I think it's different between buying enriched uranium versus buying reactors. I think the countries that are buying reactors, as Francesca said, Russia has used those relationships to build real strategic partnerships with countries. They have seen nuclear power not just as a commercial product, but as a way to build these long-term partnerships. And so it's countries that are at least somewhat friendly to Russia that had reactor projects underway with the, and that's why Finland was sort of the first to cancel in a certain sense. Whereas United States, Germany, various others are buying enriched uranium and so far haven't cut that back, although I think
Certainly.
many of them are exploring
Yep.
whether there are other options.
Yeah, but also one thing for me, at least, what was interesting in this research we started doing together is really like you go deeper into the infrastructure of this nuclear energy market, right? And you realize that the reactor is just really the tip of the iceberg. But then think about, for example, we're talking about even transportation of fuel, right? If it comes from a different producer, how much does he add to the cost, for example, right? And how does it then factor in the energy mix that countries might decide to opt for? And so, so there are so many different nuances once you touch one aspect, right? Because let's face it, it's a nuclear energy market that we say is global, but it's actually fairly dominated by a monopoly of countries, right? So once you remove one of the key players, the entire architecture needs to shift with it. And so it's also questionable, in my view, that we would be able to do it. Like once the costs become really untenable, are we really going to diversify? Because so far what we've seen, both in the European Union, European didn't even sanction oil and gas, we just can't do it. But both in the US and the European, the key concept was the cost, we can't bear the cost of this. And so I think the question mark is still pretty much alive here.
And the biggest part of the Russian market has not been in Western Europe.
Yep.
It's Bangladesh, India,
Egypt.
Egypt, et cetera. Jordan, I think, has a small
Yep.
contract. Now, I would say on the kind of macro picture here that part of what we're witnessing is a large and permanent alteration of the perception of Putin. And he's now viewed as a rule breaker, as a risk taker, as somewhat irrational or at least misguided in the sense of existing in his own little information bubble. And you take all those attributes and then throw into the picture the fact that he may now be or may soon be a desperate man. And then that circles back, I think, to Will's comment. So now you have the perception of a guy who looks like he might be pretty hard to deter, or who might be put in circumstances where deterrence would be eroded by the desperation that the Russian elite might feel. And I think that has led them to several conclusions. One is, we need to work harder to deter this guy, which will lead us to more, better, faster, but also more options. I think we're seeing concern about, the sort of the revival of the escalation ladder as an American worry, right? We spent decades worrying about what levels of the escalation ladder were disadvantageous to our side. The second thing, which I think very much affects the work that we do here in managing the atom, is this is no longer a fit partner for arms control. This is a bad guy. Dick Cheney. We don't do business with evil. And this has implications, obviously, for Russian American and even more for triangular Russian American Chinese strategic arms control. whether of the traditional force posture type or of the more fashionable these days sort of risk reduction measures. But also the non-proliferation regime, when you look carefully at its history, has rested heavily on a long tradition of Russian American, Soviet American cooperation. And I think we're already seeing some negative reverberations in the Iran negotiations now, because the constructive role that the Russians were sort of playing for most of these conversations during the Biden administration seems to have now disappeared. And furthermore, their ability to play that role is inhibited, if not eliminated, by the fact that the United States really now wants no part of them. And
similarly at the NPT PrepCom, and similarly
right,
at the
exactly,
IAEA.
exactly. So to me, that's a big part of it. And it leads, I think, to a final conclusion, which sort of cuts against the kind of arguments that Matt and John and I have been making for years about the importance of maintaining dialogue and promoting restraint and the value of diplomacy as not for its own sake, but because of its effectiveness in advancing our interests, if we understand them properly. But the overpowering impulse in Washington today is to punish and weaken Russia and Putin. And that's very, very difficult, I think, to square that with a new diplomatic initiative that tries to rebuild some of what has now been lost. So that would be my very brief 2 cents. Matt, do we have any questions from the?
Nicole Grafsky asks, how do the issues with nuclear safety in Ukraine impact the IAEA's work with Iran? Then we also have a question from David Allison. It's a bit longer, so why don't we do Nicole's first?
Okay, I think, Nick, maybe that's a good question for you to tackle.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Actually, if I could just make a comment in response to what you said, Steve. The mentality of wanting to punish Russia predates this most recent phase of the invasion of Ukraine. And certainly goes back in an acute way to 2014 with the invasion of Crimea. But we've been struggling with this dynamic for quite some time. I agree with you. I think we are at the lowest point, we have been in this sort of struggle to make the case for the value of this kind of engagement. But it's been the current that we've been pushing back for on some time. And I say this as I have a workshop with Russian colleagues next week, where we're going to be talking about non-proliferation issues of nuclear war. In response to that question, I'm actually curious how others who sort of follow Iran on a day-to-day might respond to that. But from what I've seen, I think the IAEA has sort of been walking this very fine line in trying to hold lots of different stakeholders together as it's dealing with Ukraine, as it's dealing with the JCPOA. And as far as I can see, if the JCPOA collapses remarkably, it doesn't appear that it will have, much to do with the crisis in Ukraine. It's going to be based on other factors. But I am curious what others think about that.
We're short of time, so I'm going to resist the temptation, Nick, to open up that question to our group. We've already demonstrated ourselves to be a long-winded lot. Speaking personally here. Matt, why don't you?
Yeah, and
last question.
Yeah, from David Allison. On this topic, one near universal takeaway from the first phase. One near universal takeaway from the first phase of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a downwards reassessment of Russian conventional capabilities, but failure rates of 50 to 60% for Russian cruise missiles and PGMs is much higher than even the most pessimistic or optimistic pre-conflict estimates of failure rates for Russian nuclear forces. How concerned should we be that the quality of Russian nuclear forces may have been similarly overestimated, and that U.S. planners may take this as evidence that the U.S. is closer to nuclear superiority than previously assessed, and act accordingly?
Matt, you want to tackle that one?
I'm not on the panel. So I think that the Biden administration has demonstrated a very cautious approach to Russia and its nuclear forces. And I think we'll continue to take a cautious approach. I think it is plausible that the same military that has these problems with conventional forces may have some issues also with nuclear forces, although they have traditionally tried to have nuclear forces managed by sort of elite personnel. So it may be that there's less difference from what we thought in the case of the nuclear forces. But I do think the United States understands that Russian nuclear forces are formidable, that the dangers of nuclear war are overwhelming, and that any belief that we have some sort of exploitable nuclear primacy is not likely, at least in this administration.
Francesca has a point.
Yeah, I want to add something to what Matt said and actually look mostly at dynamics of the domestic constituency. I mean, what concerns me, David, is you started seeing already on Twitter some, in my view, really ill-advised and rather dangerous rhetoric about one tweet that I read one day said, well, we shouldn't be afraid of Putin, Putin should be afraid of us. And that to me, what concerns me is that this can enable a very dangerous, like maybe extreme view that as Russia is down, but not completely out, we could try to take advantage of this, right? And that would be a catastrophic mistake because precisely of what Matt says. So for me, the risk here is that we then get emboldened, and not with this administration, but the tendency might be there for some parts. And so I think what the Biden administration has done has been incredibly intentional, very cautious, and really very ponderate. But I'm wondering, as this prolongs further, that there is this domestic constituency that might really become emboldened. And that is something that we need to watch out for, and we need to be sure to make really arguments against it.
When the Cold War ended, the Soviet military disintegrated incoherently for obvious reasons, broken into pieces and lost basing infrastructure and so on and so forth, and had huge chunks of territory and population hived off. And in addition, they went through a protracted economic crisis, which meant basically that they were broke. And the Russians responded to that by basically adopting the NATO policy of compensating for conventional weakness with nuclear reliance. The perception has been in recent years that Russia has come out of that phase, that they had rebuilt their conventional capability, that Putin is doing what he's been doing since 2014, in part because he can, in part because Russia has recovered its military strength. And I wonder if the Russians themselves look at this experience in Ukraine and see a need to, if I can put it awkwardly, rely on their nuclear escalatory threats to compensate for the weakness that they've now kind of displayed rather vividly to the world. That would be one potential implication. That might be yet another impediment to future arms control if the Russians feel they need to be in a nuclear expansion phase because of the evident difficulties of their conventional capabilities.
If I may just chime in on David Ellison's question with my 2 cents, because it's a really important question. And I think if you're standing or whatever, sitting in a trench in Ukraine right now, it's really not failure of nuclear deterrence that you're worried about. There is no nuclear deterrence to protect Ukraine from a nuclear attack by, say, a tactical nuclear weapon that's in Russian arsenal. However, what Russia has demonstrated is the vulnerability of its delivery vehicles. A lot of them are dual use. So the cruise missiles that are used now on to bomb Ukrainian cities and civilian and military targets that are launched from strategic bombers, the Tu-95s over Black and Caspian Sea, those are the same carriers that, and the same missiles, the same cruise missiles that could be nuclear armed. And only about half of those reach their targets, right? There's a hypersonic new missile that we've seen for the first time used, the Kinjal, used on the Yavyrev training base, that would be a lot more difficult to defend against, a lot more difficult to knock out of the sky with air defense systems. And there's, of course, Iskander short-range ballistic missile systems that are also nuclear capable. So I think, you know, from the Ukrainian standpoint, you see that one way to defend, to deter as a non-nuclear state is actually to build up conventional air and missile defenses, right? To bolster defenses and make sure that that one really important shot, right? If Russia were to do a demonstration shot or something that would kind of force Ukraine to capitulation, you really need to make sure that that one shot hits the target it's intended to hit, and that it works and it has that kind of effect. If it's only a 50% chance that that missile reaches its target, then it changes the calculation. So I think there's a lot more thinking that we should be doing on how to deter conventionally, perhaps, you know, tactical nuclear uses if you're a non-nuclear weapon state.
It's interesting also that there's been a partial decapitation of the Russian military through their lost leadership. But in addition, it appears that Putin has every intention of causing heads to roll once things settle down. There have to be people to blame, and it's not going to be Putin blaming himself. So it'll be interesting to see when the dust settles what the Russian capacity to redress some of their weaknesses really is, because it looks like they're entering a period of tumult in their civil military relations. That's another wrinkle. I guess we do have a couple of minutes, and to me, one question we haven't really touched on is what happens if this war doesn't end? And Nick made the point that at some level it's been ongoing for since 2014, and he's absolutely correct about that. And some degree of sanctions efforts have been in place since 2014. That, of course, was a lower grade intervention and one that the Russians themselves tried to keep disguised. So it was, what we saw on February 24th was a very significant kind of expansion of this war effort. But now, what if we settle down into a situation in eastern Ukraine that looks like a more intense version of what we've had since 2014? Where does that leave us? What does that imply for all of our nuclear issues? It seems to me, the first obvious thought is it prevents any kind of reconciliation or resolution of these issues. And that means this kind of open wound of inability to engage with Russia, inability to deal with Putin and so on is likely to be quite protracted. In which case, everything we've been talking about in terms of the potential adverse consequences essentially becomes a persistent condition. And that looks like one of the least edifying outcomes. But anybody have thoughts on that? Because it's not obvious how this war is ending right at the moment.
Well, Steve, I tend to agree with you that would prevent any hope of reconciliation, as well as, of course, prolonging the awful suffering of the Ukrainian people. But I think either way that we're likely to be, I hate to be dark, but in a period of very hostile US-Russian relations that's going to be lasting and will make measures to reduce nuclear risks on the one hand more important than ever before, but on the other hand very, very difficult to move forward with. And I think, an area where all of us have to be creative is trying to figure out what measures are actually plausible in the real political environment that's going to exist, how to make the case for them, how to build political constituencies that can get them across the threshold.
At a meeting recently in Doha, I had a conversation with William Albert, he's replaced Mark Fitzpatrick as the head of the now renamed nuclear program at IISS. And William had an interesting idea, which was to go back and inventory the very extensive portfolio of confidence building, crisis management, nuclear risk reduction measures that were put in place during the Cold War, because this was a huge sustained effort over multiple decades. And there's all kinds of things that were done and put in place, and various obscure agreements or memorandums of conversations and so on. And William's point was basically that a large number of these have become invisible in the sense that they are neglected, ignored, have atrophied, have been forgotten. And it may be that we don't need to start from scratch. We just need to revive and utilize mechanisms that already are in place. And to me, that's one place that we might do some digging, is to see what exists and to ask, in an era of intense crisis and deeply hostile US-Russian relations, why aren't we using the mechanisms meant to tame intense crises and hostile relations?
Let me give you one example. We have been doing some of that work in the ongoing academy to academy dialogue between the United States and Russia. But under the agreement on the nuclear risk reduction centers, when one party makes a change to the status of its nuclear forces, it's supposed to communicate that to the other party. When Putin directed the Minister of Defense to put the strategic forces on special combat duty, the Russians said nothing in that channel. The United States asked no questions in that channel. Absolutely no communication about it occurred in that channel. So at a certain level, at a moment of intense crises, these nuclear risk reduction centers are not being used for their originally intended purposes, but potentially could be.
Right. It much depends on whether these things are used and how they're used. I point out in my little hotline piece that in the 73 Mideast crisis, Kissinger and the Russians used the hotline to communicate threats. So we're almost out of time. So why don't I give our speakers each a final word or two? And Nick has his hand up. So I would ask Nick for you to incorporate your question into your final remarks.
Sure. This is going to be a depressing note to end on, but in response to the discussion of what happens if this keeps going, I really am deeply concerned about the possibility of some kind of radiological release in Ukraine. As Director General Grossi has said many times, the current situation is unsustainable. And the metaphor that I keep using is, I feel like what we're watching is, I hope it doesn't end up this way, but the Fukushima crisis in slow motion. That we're looking at the Fukushima crisis after the earthquake, but before the next shock. And after the initial earthquake, the regulator was in disarray. The roads were inaccessible. Offsite power was cut off. It created enormous vulnerability at the Fukushima site, not to mention others. So when the tsunami eventually hit, it caused the catastrophic reaction that we saw. We haven't seen what the tsunami is going to be like in Ukraine. I hope we don't. But the longer the war goes on, the more vulnerable, that means those facilities will be vulnerable to some kind of shock like that.
Great. Mariana, final word?
Yes, unfortunately, I'm looking for this happy ending, and I'm grappling with the reality that I don't have anything too happy to say. But just to build on your comments, Steve, I think what we're looking at is actually kind of a system shifting, if not entirely changing situation, in which one of the main stakeholders of the entire international nuclear order, whether it's in the realm of nuclear energy or in the realm of nuclear weapons, right, in the realm of nuclear nonproliferation. As you mentioned, much of the regimes that have been built up over decades have rested on this cooperation or collusion or even common interests of the major nuclear stakeholders and the major nuclear powers. I think we see, one of these powers gone rogue, and it is an unprecedented situation. Even though there have been really cold moments of the Cold War, I think not to the same degree as what we're seeing today with the war, with the invasion of Ukraine. So I think we'd have to rethink how to bolster these institutions in the absence of this great power collusion, of this great power cooperation. Thank you.
Final word to Francesca and Marina.
Sure. So I completely echo what Nick and Mariana have just mentioned. We have seen a radical shift or a call for a radical shift. And to call back to John's point from the earlier session, nuclear energy has a really pivotal role, or can have a really pivotal role to play in the climate change arena. And yet again, we're seeing another question that might inhibit nuclear energy's ability to contribute. I went to COP26 in Glasgow last year, and I was very happy to see the Russian Federation pavilion, but it was essentially Rosatom. And so, and so that begs the question, how can Russia be a player, not just in nuclear energy, but also in climate change conversations, when its major body, Rosatom, and by extension, other vehicles are being currently crippled by sanctions and excluded politically from the conversation. So for me, what I'm also looking for is to see how Russia shows up, if it shows up in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Egypt, in this year's COP27, and what those conversations can come out looking like.
Francesca, any final word? That's it. Well, we've come to the end of our time. Let me thank our speakers. I think we had three usefully and interestingly different presentations that raised different pieces of the puzzle. I think one of the big takeaways is, sadly, our agenda is full. Sadly, the challenges are large. Sadly, the need for creative thinking and bold efforts is large. But this means there's a lot of work for us to do, and work that, if we can have even modest successes, can contribute some real value to introducing at least a little bit of light in what Matt keeps calling a dark period. So with that, let me call this session to a close. We have another session with Bonnie Jenkins starting at noon, I think. So she'll have a conversation with Matt. And so until then, we have a brief break. Thank you very much. Thanks to our speakers.
right, welcome everyone. For those of you just tuning in now, I'm Matthew Bunn. I'm the faculty lead for the Managing Anna project. We've been celebrating the 21st anniversary of the project, 25th anniversary of the project today. And I'm very pleased and excited to end our celebration with a conversation with Undersecretary of State Bonnie Jenkins, the Undersecretary for International Security and Arms Control, and long ago, a former fellow in the Managing the Atom project. So thank you, Bonnie, for being willing to come and spend some time with us.
It's my
at
pleasure.
Managing
Thank
the
you.
Atom.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we're going to have a conversation for a little while, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So let me start off with a big picture one. In your role as Undersecretary, what do you see as some of the top priorities for the next year or two?
I think obviously the first priority is what I call reestablishing the importance of arms control and non-proliferation disarmament. I think that the U.S. role in that has diminished a bit in the last administration, and so it's very important that we reestablish that leadership role, but also that we establish the importance of arms control and its role in terms of stability, strategic stability. I think that we may talk about this later. The nuclear saber rattle, the disinformation on chemical and biological weapons. I think all of those have, in the attempt of Russia to tarnish the non-proliferation regime for WMD. But I think there's opportunities to reestablish how important these regimes are. And if anything, I think it's really show why it's important to have these kind of regimes on non-proliferation and disarmament and arms control. So that's one of my major priorities. And then there's other things like getting back to engaging Russia on these issues at some point in the future, engaging China on these issues, but also emerging technology. Had a great conversation just now with some of your experts on emerging tech and the role of emerging technology in arms control and non-proliferation disarmament. There's a lot of questions there that we still have to find answers to. And then there's other things like promoting peaceful uses of nuclear power to promote better climate change issues, nuclear energy, taking advantage of the gaps that exist now with Russia in terms of how its perception is going to be by other countries to engage Russia on buying equipment and nuclear reactors. So there's a number of things that are, but a lot of it is basically on the changing landscape that we're faced right now and trying to reassert our leadership.
So you mentioned that changing landscape and the war in Ukraine and the need at some point to get back to engaging Russia. But we have this situation where Russia has violated so many international agreements and norms in the actions it's committed in Ukraine. How does that affect our thinking about the future of arms control? To me, it seems to make nuclear risk reduction on the one hand all the more important, but on the other hand, much more difficult to actually achieve. How do you think about it?
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Russians will come back to us and say, well, you've also violated a lot of arms control agreements, or a lot of agreements. So I totally agree with you on that in terms of, we do have to think about, we can't ignore the fact that Russia has violated conventions. However, we're still in a position where we still have to work with them. And, they do have an interest in a New START treaty. And we have to find ways that we could work with them, strengthen ways of verification, strengthen ways of diplomacy with them after we get out of this current situation. We're kind of stuck with the situation where we still need to work with them and we still need to find ways to work with them. And risk reduction is obviously part of the mix, in terms of how we work with them. So, as we think about, next steps and going back to the changing landscape, that's part of the question is how do we work with Russia after Ukraine? How do we work with Russia in light of the violations that we have accused them of? Recognize that we still have to work with them. And that's one of the outstanding questions.
given the difficulties of getting 2/3 for a positive agreement with Russia in the Senate, do you think that in the future, and given you were mentioning emerging technologies, and those often are not things that you can sort of count in the way that we've counted missiles in past arms control agreements. Do you think in the future we may make more use of unilateral and reciprocal initiatives like the recent announcement that the United States made on kinetic ASAT tests and executive agreements and various other tools beyond negotiated treaties?
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that. One is there are agreements that we are going to want to be legally binding, international law. So we will have to engage the Senate to get 2/3. That means we're going to have to be very transparent with them. I know that we are doing much more in terms of briefings the Senate nowadays to keep them up to date on what we're doing on many issues in the arms control disarmament space and international security. So I think we have to recognize the challenges and also, which means we have to bring them aboard, bring them along from the very beginning. But I also think this does open the need, I think, and possibility for having different ways of approaching these issues. I don't think treaties are going to be the only way we can do these in the future. I don't think it's appropriate in some cases. I think some of the emerging technology issues don't lend themselves to arms control agreements. They do lend themselves more to norms or to codes of conduct. So we'll have to see. I know one of the things we focus on in space, for example, is developing code of conduct for that. And the Russians are more interested in an arms control agreement on space issues, which would be very difficult to verify. And there's a lot of actors. So there's challenges in doing an arms control agreement on space, for example. So we need to look at different ways. And they may be unilateral statements that we hope other countries will themselves do them similar ones, or various ways in which we can do it leading up to actual agreements. Yeah.
The problem with the norms approach to me is that Russia has ripped up so many norms in its invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, where there are norms that they would see the maintenance of them as serving their own national interests, maybe we could get somewhere.
Yeah, they're definitely going to be much more abiding by the ones that they think are much more in their interest. I mean, if you look at the START Treaty, the New START Treaty, they see that in their interest, mainly because it allows them to do inspections on us, and we can do inspections on them. And so they see that as in their interest. I mean, we all do things that are in our interest. So it's not it's not just like they do. No country is going to agree to give up anything unless they feel like it's in their national interest to do so. But yes, something that's much more in line with an interest that's longstanding, they'll certainly abide by.
So I think that's an important point that you just made, and it's one that my colleague Steve Miller has been making these last couple of days, that arms control is something you do with enemies. It's something you do to promote your own national interest. It's not something you do to be nice to the other side. And I think that's something we're definitely going to have to remember going forward with Russia. Still speaking of Russia, we've seen some truly remarkable nuclear saber rattling on the Russian side, both implicit and explicit threats of nuclear use, Putin personally overseeing various tests of nuclear forces, ordering nuclear forces onto special combat duty, etc. How, if at all, has that affected your thinking about the risks of escalation in the Ukraine conflict?
Well, it certainly made us have to consider that as part of possibilities for escalation. One of the things that we have done, the US and other countries has been trying, and I think we've been successful in trying to tamp that down. Tamp down the rhetoric, not highlight it, not focus on it. I wouldn't say ignore it, but just to show that the US is not going to be responding in a way that's going to continue to escalate it. Despite their talk about nuclear the nuclear saber rattling, they haven't done really anything that we have observed that is actually taking steps to actually do it,
Right.
which is positive. So, you know, it obviously is disruptive in terms of concern, and it's basically got more people, more Americans focusing on nuclear issues now than for a long time, which we can use to our advantage for education. But it's also made us realize that we have to think carefully about how we respond to that, and think carefully about what we say as a government in response to that. And, you know, the other, you know, France and the UK similarly has downplayed what they've been saying.
Mhm. So you gave, I thought, a quite important speech on the future of arms control at NATO last fall. And one of many things you emphasized was the importance of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the success of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. How do you see the upcoming review conference? And what are there any promising areas of common ground that we might be able to pursue there?
Well, I see excuse me, I have allergies, so my voice is a little.
Everything is blooming now. If you're allergic to anything, you've
yeah,
got allergies.
it's not great. So.
There is water right behind you. If you
Great,
like.
thank you. I appreciate it. There's two ways of looking at this. I mean, some people are looking at the recent saber rattling by Russia as gloom and doom for nuclear non-proliferation and arms control overall. And then there's others who are saying, well, we're going to use and it's not maybe contradictory, but we're going to take advantage of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Review Conference to, what we want to do is reassert the importance of it, to reaffirm commitments to it, and to highlight where it has been successful. And the fact that, at least to date, hopefully by then, in August, still, you know, despite the saber rattling, they have not been used. But we do recognize that, you know, Russia can come in and be a disruptive factor and create problems for us. It's going to be a challenge to get a consensus document, which is what we always want at the end of a conference like this, is to have a consensus document. However, there are still opportunities to work with like-minded states. There's still opportunities to have statements by a number of countries working together to show the commitments to it. There's opportunities for international organizations to make commitments to it and why it's important. So I think we're taking the opposite view of, we know Russia is going to be a problem. We don't for sure, but probably. So that's a given. And if that is a given, then we have to think about how we can be successful. How do you define success in that situation? Which may not be a consensus document, but it may be other things that we can do with countries to reaffirm the importance of it. Even though one of those countries is a nuclear weapon state that may not be part of those statements, there's still a lot of other countries who are part of the treaty and convention who can still show how important it is.
It is a sad situation. I mean, in a certain sense, the United States and the Soviet Union and then Russia built the non-proliferation regime together. To be in a situation where they're at loggerheads, even on that topic, is a distressing situation to be in. Let me relatedly turn to the ban treaty, the nuclear weapons ban treaty. The nuclear weapon states, including the United States, have long been pretty harshly critical of not only the ban treaty, but the states supporting the ban treaty. And of course, the supporters of the ban treaty have been very harshly critical of the states that possess nuclear weapons. Is there any way to get into a more productive conversation between supporters and critics of the nuclear ban treaty?
I think there's a couple of things. So I think that we've been trying recently not to be as critical, as harsh as I know the past administration has been on the treaty. So we tamped down our criticism of it, and because we basically understand and recognize the goals of what the countries want to achieve, which we agree with. We want to have disarmament. We want to get rid of nuclear weapons. We've committed to that, but we also still continue to have our concerns about the treaty. And, you know, the lack of verification, for example, but even more so the fact that, and we've seen recently with Russia and Ukraine, that you have to take into context the existing situation that we have. And so having Russia, for example, nuclear saber rattling that they've been doing puts a strain on the situation in terms of countries that do want to get rid of their weapons, because now we have to see, we're looking at how Russia's using them. So when we're talking about disarmament, the goal is there. We understand the goal. We all want the goal, but we have to put it in context of what is happening, what is occurring in today, in the landscape, in security landscape, and the challenges that presents. So the areas, there could be areas of discussion, and I hope that during the 4 weeks in New York in August, that countries can have conversations and find places where we can have agreed statements. But I think both sides have to come to the table without carrying we're going to sit here and criticize you. Instead, come with a much more amenable, working together perspective to see what we can agree to. And I think that would be, and I think that's what certainly what the U.S. is going to try to do, because we're going to try to come away from this conference with things that we have agreed to.
So let me get back to your NATO speech. One of the things that you mentioned was a desire for China to begin participating in some of these discussions, not necessarily in limiting the numbers of their strategic forces or what have you. And that seems all the more important now that we know about hundreds of new missile silos under construction and so on. But the obvious question is, well, what could we offer that would convince China it was in its national interest to start talking about some of these kinds of things?
Yeah, we're still trying to figure that out, because we have the P5, or we had the P5, and we may in the future have a P5. But that has been one place where we have been able to talk to the Chinese, of course, the Russians, of course, but also the Chinese on issues generally. But getting them to commit to having a bilateral with us on, we're not even talking about arms control, but just risk reduction or crisis management has been very challenging. In the virtual conversation between Biden and Xi last year, Biden did raise this issue with him, but in the Chinese kind of, okay, we're kind of hearing it, but nothing has really come out after that, even though we've been trying, and we continue to try to, reach out to them and say it's important to have these discussions. We're not pushing for arms control. We just want to start having some conversations so that we can avoid miscalculation, misperceptions about why what is your purpose, why you're doing all of this in terms of building up your military complex and the silos. So we have not really been successful yet. So we haven't found the magic words to get them to the table. I know there's misperceptions about what our intentions are. They've been very clear. They don't want arms control. They don't want strategic stability, which we're not asking for. And misperceptions about what we mean by crisis management. Sometimes they say, does crisis management mean you want to create a crisis and then manage it? So it's, and we don't have an opportunity to sit down and explain what exactly we mean. So we're not there yet, but we're still pushing for it.
I should mention in the National Academy dialogue with our Chinese counterparts, on the one hand, said we should go back to those kinds of dialogues, and mentioned the ones that took place during the Obama administration in a very positive light. But then at the very end, the chair on the Chinese side said, yes, these are important. They should happen at some point, but the atmosphere is not right today. And some of the things that they had mentioned during the course of the conversation were, the retired senior officials traveling to Taiwan and various things related to Taiwan, basically.
Well, the thing also to keep in mind is, despite the issues that's going on now with Russia, Ukraine, we have a long history of negotiations with Soviet Union and Russia. So we have been able to figure out, short of an invasion, how we can continue to have discussions with Russia. even the bilaterals between Russia and the US for the New START treaty for inspections, they can still continue. We can still talk to the Russians on that. And we're still trying to find a date that we can meet with them to try to figure out, just to have discussions on the New START treaties. We can continue, even though pretty much everything else has been postponed. But we have always been able to figure out how do we disassociate, how do you decouple the important issues of arms control, nuclear arms control from other issues. This situation right now makes it very difficult, but we don't have that experience with China. And so, helping them understand that we can still talk about importance of nuclear, because nuclear is such a vastly separate thing that you have to be able to learn, how can I sit across the table with you, even though you anger me, I don't like your culture, we're not talking anything like that. But, or we don't like the strategic way in which you're building up Taiwan, or with Russia or with the Soviet Union, we don't like your way of government is run. We don't like communism, but we still are able to have conversations with them. We can't do, Taiwan, China doesn't have that history. And so I don't know how you acquire that, because we've done it with Russia and Soviet Union for so many years, but that's a factor.
Steve Miller was pointing out, I think it was yesterday, that we negotiated the first SALT treaty when the Russians were the main arms providers against our troops in Vietnam, and possibly there were some Soviet pilots flying some flights against our planes in Vietnam, and the NPT was completed just as the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, and so we do have that experience, and it'll be interesting trying to sort of build that over time with the Chinese.
Right.
Let me ask you about North Korea. So they continue a remarkable pace of missile tests. They appear to be preparing for a nuclear test. They've made it pretty clear they have no intention of eliminating their nuclear stock, at least in the near term. While still keeping that long-term goal in mind, what could we do to try to negotiate something that would at least mitigate some of the nuclear dangers posed by North Korea's program?
North Korea is a very challenging one, obviously. We've been very open from the very beginning that we are willing to talk to you anytime, any place. Just let us know we want to have some kind of diplomacy. And they have not responded. They have not come back to us at all. Instead, they've been testing. So it remains a very difficult one. We've been working much more with our allies to try to figure out ways in which we can work this issue. We think we didn't do as much of that in the past administration, so we're trying to do more engagement with South Korea, we've had some really good engagement with them, and Japan, obviously.
Including with the new government in South Korea?
Yeah. So, we're trying to think through the problem much more multilaterally with that. But right now, there's no silver bullet with the DPRK if they will not talk to us, and instead continue to test. So we keep the options open, but we also, are very clear that, this is not the way to go forward, and just being very, strict with them on that and working with our allies. It's a very challenging one, as you know.
So another challenging one is Iran, and the administration.
Keep on coming.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I don't have any very cheery topics to ask you about.
It's not
but the administration, of course, has been trying to get back to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That hasn't come to fruition yet. Critics say, oh, you shouldn't do that because now the timelines are too short and it doesn't cover missiles and it doesn't cover regional behavior. Why, in your view, would getting back to the agreement be the best option for U.S. security?
Because it's the best option to work with Iran not to develop, so they won't develop a nuclear weapon. That's always been the major point of the JCPOA. Unfortunately, by getting out, we now see a situation where the timeline is shorter. They have enriched much more, and we've lost the ability to inspect the way we were before. So that still remains what is the golden key is to, which has always been the major focus of the JCPOA. And so that's why we need to get back into it, because I'm not seeing any other option that's going to do that. And I think it's important to keep in mind that these other issues do exist. Ballistic missiles were concerns, their activity in the region remain, but those were never the goals of the JCPOA. We wanted to get to the nuclear issue first, because that was the most immediate issue, as many of you remember, back in the days when we kept accusing each other. Yes, you're trying to go. No, we're not. Yes, you are. No, we're not. Yes, you are. We're doing everything that we can do under the NPT. And so, and we're able to do on the NPT. So we had to stop that. Meanwhile, they were continuing to do things. So trying after the fact to try to fit the missile issue and the regional issue into a treaty that was never supposed to address those issues was always not a fair argument, because it's like in hindsight saying, oh, you should have done all of that. But at the time, and even now, we have an important issue that we need to fix first. And it doesn't mean we can't work on the other things, but at least if you start, you have a dialogue, you have a way of communication, and you can talk to them on a regular basis, and then maybe build upon that. But right now, because we got out, we don't have anything. And we don't have a way to deal with the nuclear issue, but we still don't deal with the other ones either.
Do you have a guesstimate of of the odds? I probably shouldn't ask a serving official that.
Well, I guess my official answer would be that I don't, it's hard to know what the odds are. Of course, we just hope that it will actually work out. I mean, that's our hope.
So you've been, over the course of your career, a particular leader on biological issues. Excuse me. Both biological weapons, but also biosafety to prevent pandemics like the one we're suffering through now. Particularly with the global health security agenda during the Obama administration. What steps should we be taking now that would help us reduce both chemical and biological dangers?
Well, I think all the disinformation that we've been dealing with, I think has been, the one positive is that it's increased the recognition for why we need to address issues of chemical and biological weapons, why we need to continue to focus on non-proliferation, disarmament issues in both those spaces. And in the chemical weapons side, we have been working with Ambassador Manso at OPCW, been doing a great job in putting out statements about disinformation, but also continue to hammer on the Russians about their use of chemical weapons, dealing with the Syrian issue, but also the funding that we're putting into the OPCW, the chem tech work they're doing, and also the chemical security work we're doing around the world. So OPCW is doing what it's supposed to be doing. We're trying to find ways to strengthen its ability in terms of verification, identification of use of chemical weapons, and it remains a very important part of what we do. On the biological weapons side, as you know, I've just appointed a new special representative, Ken Ward, who was the ambassador for the OPCW, but worked with me back in the days of ACTA, where he started working on biological weapons, which has been great because he was at the PrepCom in Geneva last month. And it was just great having him there to show that the US remains very committed to the Biological Weapons Convention. And they're going to have their own review conference later this year, November, December timeframe. And we have an idea for having a process to try to get the PWC out of its stalemate it's currently in, where a number of countries are still pushing for a verification regime, which, as you know, the US has had a problem with trying to promote. So we're trying to find a two-step process so we can find areas where there is agreement, the low-hanging fruit, to have some agreements going forward, and have a longer-term discussion on issues related to verification, but also other issues that have been sticking points amongst countries in the BWC. So Ken Ward is working on that and has already started engaging countries on moving that forward. On infectious disease issues, we still, within my ISN Bureau, International Security and Operation Bureau, doing a lot of work on biosecurity, biosafety, building that work around the world, making sure that laboratories are safe and secure, so we can try to prevent future infectious diseases like COVID, like Ebola, when the global security agenda was actually launched 2 months before Ebola, which was a timing couldn't be more perfect. So the GHSA still exists. We have 70 countries now who are all committed to capacity building to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease threats. It's a long-term strategy because it takes a lot to get countries to be able to prevent, detect, and respond, as we are seeing with COVID-19. So we are still working on ways in which to do that. And of course, in my space and T space, we focus on the intentional side, and we, in the other parts of the government, work on the accidental and the natural design. Yeah.
So the initiative you created, Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Resolution, has been a real leader in diversity and inclusion and belonging in the nuclear space, along with other security spaces. What are, in your view, some of the most significant obstacles that we still need to deal with, and what are some of the most important things that organizations in the nuclear space need to be doing?
I think the two, there's several obstacles. Two big obstacles I think would be having role models and seeing people who look like themselves. And I think this is true in almost any space, is to bring more people into a space. They have to feel like they are in that space. And if they don't see people who look like themselves, they will just feel like, there's no place for me there, particularly in a hard security area anyway. I think we've done very well in increasing women in this field. We still have a long way in terms of people of color. But one of the reasons why I established the organization is for that reason. Mainly, I was focused on weapons of mass destruction because I've been in this field for a long time and I was not seeing people who look like me coming up behind me. And so that's the main reason why I established it. But then when I established it, I broadened it to all types of peace and security, because I hear from many areas, women of color and people of color who say, I'm the only one who look like myself. They get discouraged, they leave the field, and it never changes. And I also wanted people to see how their issues interact. But seeing people who look like themselves is one of the biggest things. And then finding ways and helping them understand how to get into the field. Because there may be an interest, but there's always this feeling like, it's STEM, it's technology, it's science. I'm a lawyer. I am not a scientist. I've been in this field for many years. I tell people that you don't have to be a biologist or a nuclear physicist or a chemist to get into this field. If you're a policy person, if you do international relations, if you do public affairs, there's a spot for you to work with the scientists. But there's a feeling out there still that if you want to be, even at State Department, other bureaus of State Department like stay away from T, because they do the STEM work, or they have all the acronyms and the nuclear, and they stay away from my bureau, which sometimes I don't mind. But there's always this feeling that it's trying to demystify it, and I have seen many more people of color, young people of color now getting into the field, and spreading out amongst, and I'm seeing them more in think tanks and NGOs in Washington, D.C. And labs, DOE labs. So now it's now that people see it, it's like the dam has been broken, and now more people are interested.
All right, we should open it up to the audience, but let me ask you one last question. So you were a Managing Adam Fellow earlier in your career. Can you offer us any reflections on Managing Adam, what effect it had on you and your career, what you see as important things for non-government organizations like Managing Adam to be doing now?
Well, I could say I had a great time here. I have so many wonderful memories here. Just the experiences, meeting the other fellows. I was a pre-doc, so I met the other fellows. When I was writing my dissertation, I was at the University of Virginia, which is where I received my PhD. There was only one place I wanted to go to write it, and it was here, because I said, this is my world, this is where I want to write, and have all the experts here, all of the programs, and just subsuming myself in this space was what I wanted. And so I couldn't tell you how thrilled I was when I was accepted. Thank you for that. We'll give it here. And it was such a wonderful experience. And even now, everything feels like it's different now. I don't even know where the hallway is with all the photos.
Yeah, we built some more buildings.
I know.
since you were here.
Everything's unfamiliar to me now. But whenever I come visit, I'd like to look at the photos and remind myself sitting outside taking the photos here. And so, it was really for me, which I knew it would be a place where it would challenge me. I would be challenged by the professors. I'd be challenged by folks like you and Steve and John and others here, and just absorbing the knowledge and experience. And so it's really been, I think, a turning point for my life. It's helped me to jump into this field even more, and your help launching me at the Ford Foundation, which I always go back to you because you're the one that made me interested in going to the Ford Foundation, and just help me understand the many ways that I could use my experience here, because all the things I've done since I've left here. So, and I would just, all of you who are here, you're all experiencing this environment and this knowledge and this, all the expertise that's here. So it's been amazing.
Great. So let's open it up to the audience. I see Aditi has her hand up.
I have a two-part question.
Okay.
I want to go back to something you just touched about, W gaps and diversified field. And the first part of the question is, I'm really curious. This equity lens that you really emphasized from a perspective of bringing new people to the field and to the table. How does that then translate specifically for you? How does that equity lens shape how you approach some of the problems that you talked about over the last hour? And then the second question, I was really excited to see that Marina recently joined your team.
Yes.
Marina and I went to grad school.
Oh, good.
And so I'm really curious to learn how, what role scientists and engineers play on your team here at MTA, sort of a flipped environment in some sense after coming from the nuclear engineering department, where most of the people here are humanists and social scientists. I'm really curious to hear how your team specifically, what is the role that scientists and engineers play in shaping the work?
So on the first question, I think one of the positive things about having people with different backgrounds in a room is that the approach is natural. Because I grew up in the South Bronx, New York. There's very few people in my area when I go to a meeting in Washington who have the background and experiences that I have leading up to where I am today. So when I come to a room, I bring all that with me. And so when I sit around a table, my view is going to be shaped by my experiences and what I have experienced in life and the challenges that I've met and overcome that are different from other people's. And so, part of it is not even something that I have to think about. And that's the advantage of having different people around the room, is that it automatically enriches the conversation because they bring it with them. And the problem is when you don't have that, then you have much more groupthink because you have people who all have relatively the same kind of experiences, maybe from different parts of the US, for example. But if they all have somewhat relatively similar experiences in life, it's a lot easier for everyone to agree to some of the same things. And if you don't, and the challenge is then if you don't have somebody else to throw in to say, maybe you want to look at it this way, or maybe you should think about it coming from this perspective. It's less likely that that decision is going to be as good a decision as it could be because it won't be challenged. So what you bring is you bring your natural self. You bring who you are, the people you've met. Growing up in the Bronx, New York is different from somebody who grew up in, on Fifth Avenue in New York, in Midtown Manhattan. It's just different. And not that one's better or one's worse, it's just different. And for me, I always want the best decision I can get. So I don't want groupthink. Give me challenges, give me people who have a different experience, because then what results from that will be tested, On the second one, we have a lot of the AAAS fellows in the Bureau, people who have, biological, we're scientists and things like that. And in an area where so much of the work is in fact talking about nuclear, biological, chemical issues, radiological issues, emerging techs. We've got all of that now. It's hard to do this work without having that background. I am not a nuclear physicist, but I know somebody who's right next to me who tells me what I need to know. I will check with them. I will check my policies with them because I'm like, yeah, this is a policy, but is it going to make sense? This is a policy on nuclear non-proliferation on an issue on verification. I need somebody who understands the intricacies of things to make sure that what we as a policy people are saying makes sense in the real world. It makes sense in the real world in terms of nuclear propulsion. If we're going to have a new treaty with the Russians, another START treaty, and we're going to be including all nuclear types of nuclear weapons, right? It's going to require a different kind of verification. So we're going to need people who know technology, who know tech, who can. I can't do that. I didn't know that stuff. I can promote the policy. I can sit there and do that part of it. But we need people who understand nuclear issues, physics, all that kind of stuff to tell me, what do we need to look for? How do we verify this? What are we going to be trying to do with this? So you need people within State Department who can tell us that. And that's the kind of stuff like Marina would be doing.
John, I saw your hand up.
Yes, so thanks, Bunny, for all of these comments. Thanks for being with us. I have a question about the process in the administration for deciding what kinds of activities with Russia can go forward and what kinds cannot. You mentioned that there are continuing discussions in the arms control domain, at least some of them are ongoing. I recall that at the time that Russia invaded Crimea, there was a process in the National Security Council for deciding what kinds of activities with Russia could continue and which ones could not. Decisions were made about collaboration in science in particular that concluded that collaboration could continue on the Arctic, could continue on space, and could continue in certain areas of fundamental science. The problem was that those guidelines were classified. The guidelines at the National Security Council were classified, and there was actually a considerable problem that across the departments and agencies, there were lots of people who needed to know what was permitted for them who couldn't find out because the guidance was classified. I'm just wondering, are we going to do better this time? Is there a coherent, comprehensive process for figuring out what kinds of activities with Russia can go forward and which ones not, both government to government and below government to government? I've seen guidance from the Treasury Department on what kinds of NGO interactions with Russia can continue.
Yes, there is a process. There is a process. When all this first started, there's obviously the questions about, Russia's in a number of multilateral entities. Can we even talk to? Can we talk to them? Which one should we be engaging with them? On the SSD, there was a process, an interagency process to decide what we can do or what we can't. Of course, those are the big things. So SSD, New START, for example, those are the things that fit in that early conversation because they're big.
Right.
In terms of high level of importance. But we're still trying to figure some of that out because not everything fit in that high category. So it was more of a, unless you fit in this category, we don't do it. And that's pretty much the way it was. But there's still other things, there's still little things. It's hard to try to figure everything out. I know in the NGO world, for example, I've been asked by, folks, like, should we be talking to the Russians on this? And I say, well, particularly in the NGO world or Track 2, for example, please go ahead and talk to them. I mean, we have to have something going on, and some kind of engagements going on. But there is a process, and of course, some departments can make some of their own once that big one is done, and then for other issues, Treasury can make decisions about its engagements that are just Treasury related. State Department can make other ones that are just State Department related, that are not as interagency. So there is a process. There are ongoing discussions all the time about that. I still get questions from my colleagues in Geneva because we have a presence in Geneva of TFOS who work on the CD, conflict and disarmament. They still have questions on something. So it's not all decided yet. There are still areas where we still get questions of can we talk to them in some kind of a way. But normally it's push come to shove, unless it's a category that we said you can, then normally we try not to. So it's not totally satisfactory, but and you know, the more that Russia does stuff and atrocities, more likely you're not going to talk to them in many kinds.
Let me nudge you on one particular aspect you mentioned, which is New Start. My understanding is that New Start inspections have been on hold since the pandemic began in March of 2020. Do you expect that they will resume, or do you expect they will remain on hold?
A lot of that depends on, I mean, the conversations can go back and forth. If in fact there's discussion, because they're still trying to figure out the date and the time to meet. If they were to agree to do inspections, then there would probably be another question back in DC about whether we can actually do it. I would imagine that if it could be done logistically, if there aren't any issues of, you know, any kind of safety concerns, that they, you know, just without any guidance from Washington on this, I would think it probably could. Only because it's already been decided that can continue, and that's kind of a special case that can be made if we get pushback from the general public, or it says, why are you doing this with them? They're horrible people. Why are you doing these things? We have a case that we can make about
Why it's in the U.S. national
why it's in our
interest.
national interest.
Mayumi, I saw your hand up.
Thank you. So my name is Mayumi Fukushima. I used to be a Japanese diplomat working in the Australian Alliance, and I worked with many of the brilliant U.S. diplomats like you, and I really, you know, reminisce of talkers. So, you know, I have to tell you though that, you know, U.S. diplomacy, U.S. diplomatic corps doesn't enjoy great reputation of law, right? So individually, they're brilliant, but you know, as a group, I don't like. Sometimes I see some dissonance. Maybe I don't know. Maybe between some realist approach and liberal internationalist approach. You know, I can give you an example. For example, when I observe what's going on in Ukraine and the U.S. approach to that, and then I wonder, you know, if you take a realist approach, it's clear that, you know, as we talked before, like, you know, it's clear that we need to keep this channel open with Russians to, you know, for the purpose of escalation control and many other purposes. And also, I don't know, for this, you know, economic sanctions, binding, you know, make them binding and more effective. We need to talk to other, you know, autocratic regimes like Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia could pump more oils to reduce oil prices, right?
We need to get to the question mark.
Right, okay. But, you know, so this is so realist. If you take a realist approach, you should be talking to the Russians, you should be talking to Saudi Arabia and Chinese. On the other hand, the majority of the diplomats are taking internationalist approach, and they just reject talking to all those countries. And so I see this dissonance. And so, you know, to describe this war in Ukraine, Biden administration says, this is the stake is the survival of the democracy. It's a democracy versus democracy. And my reaction is, why would you say that? You know, when at the moment when we really need help with, you know, countries like China, South Korea, right? And we need to keep this channel open with Russians for escalation. And so, can you shed light on, you know, what's going on here? Is this a kind of clash between different schools of thought, or something else, like, you know, keep something else like audience in Europe or allies, you know, those democracies?
Yeah, well,
that should be on our side.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to start out by to explain what different people may be saying in a court in different contexts. So I'm not sure how that is playing out, but I guess a couple things. With the Russia situation, first of all, I don't think anyone thought this was going to last as long. I think that everyone kind of thought that this was going to be, Russia come in. We had no idea this was going to last as long, okay, as a backdrop. And I think at the very beginning, it was very clear, it was very important for us to stand firm against what Russia was doing in terms of invading Ukraine. And so it was very important, despite, we had a few areas where we could talk to Russia, to cut it down and shut it off. Because we had to give the strong message that a country cannot invade another country, the way, what was happening. And so that's why it was like, no talking to Russia, even though, as we all know, diplomacy is about talking with your enemies. It's about talking to your friends, but diplomacy is also talking with your enemies. But there comes a point, I think there's a belief that when something becomes so egregious that even that has to be shut down. But like I said, we know that there's some places we could talk about. And so, but that won't be forever. I mean, we all know at some point we'll talk with the Russians again. We just don't know when. At some point we need to get back to the table for another START treaty. We just don't know when. And as long as the atrocities and things keep going, it makes it more and more challenging to figure out when that time's going to come. But we want to talk to China. We do talk to Saudi Arabia. We do talk to other countries. We have ongoing dialogue with them on many issues. We're not trying to, my perception, if I understand the question, say we're not going to talk to some countries on issues. But the Russia situation is as it is. And hopefully it'll change and we can get to, whenever that point comes when Russia stops doing what it's doing, gives us time to kind of reassess, figure out where we are, we would be able to start making overtures again. I don't know when it's going to be. I would imagine that in the area of SSD and START and more in discussions with them, it'll be one of the first areas where we will start talking with them again, I would imagine. But it's just where we are right now in terms of that. And we do have a diplomatic corps that has different types of viewpoints.
Do we have questions online, Matt?
Do you have a question from Richard Weiss? How does the administration view the growing calls in Japan and South Korea for some kind of nuclear sharing arrangement akin to the arrangements in NATO?
I don't really know exactly what our viewpoint, because I'm not really up to date on that one. So I don't really have a specific answer to that. I would imagine that I would imagine that we probably wouldn't. We don't have a no, we can't do it kind of response to that. I would imagine it's more of a, and in context, talking about nuclear deterrence, looking at how we're dealing with North Korea, understanding why that concern is there, and understanding why there would be something like that. We have such strong relationships right now with South Korea and with Japan on these issues, and like I said, nuclear deterrence, and on issues like that, it wouldn't be, in my view, a total no on that. But I don't have an official answer to that, so I couldn't say for sure.
I would hope that we would be quite cautious in escalating our nuclear commitments in that part of the world. Matt, do we have other, no? Okay.
That's it.
Here in the room, then, Nicole.
Thank you so much. I was wondering about Russian cooperation with the United States on the JCPOA and whether that's been affected. Specifically with civilian cooperation with the JCPOA. Is the U.S. looking for potential other parties to assume some of the roles that Russia traditionally played? Are we looking that far in the future, or are we still going to continue?
No, we're not looking, particularly not right now with things as they are. We're not really looking at others playing that role. For a while there, we had a pretty good relationship with Russia on the JCPOA, and then helping us in some particular ways with that. So now we're not, I think right now we're with the ones we have. We're not really looking outside.
Will, I saw next.
Hi, Will D'Ambroso, fellow here. Thank you so much. A question about when various policies may be phased out somewhere down the line, even if we don't see a dramatic change in facts on the ground in various theaters. Is there a time when we say, we've exacted our cost against, say, North Korea? They are going to have nuclear weapons going forward. We need to move on. Is there any sort of process around that? Is there we were actually talking in this room about an hour ago about what if this is the new normal in Ukraine for a long time? And is there some way to get back to some sense of normalcy, a changed normalcy, but some sense of normalcy if we don't see more change on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, we will get to some sort of normalcy. The question is, what will that look like? You know, and what does normalcy mean? And is it really normal? And I think, you know, there will come a point, you know, where we don't know how it's going to. We know what's happened and what has not happened. We know that they wanted Kiev. That didn't work. So we know that. So they're in the east part now. You know, so maybe that means that the west part is now normal in the fact that they haven't gotten over there. Maybe they'll try to get the east and stay over there. So we don't yet know what that is, but there will be some kind of maybe normalcy. Maybe the better way is status quo or where it's going to be. You know, at some point it will end. We don't know when that's going to be. Will it be, you know, skirmishes for the next few years? Even that will at some point be called normal. Because, well, normal's not the right word. At some point that will be called, that's where we are. And things will settle down at some point where we will have relationships with Russia again. We may forever criticize them for what they've done. We may forever criticize them for where they may be at that time, but we will get back to talking to them. And then maybe that's what will be normal. The North Korea one, that's a difficult one in terms of what normal will be. Will there come a point where, yes, they have nuclear weapons, yes, they have missiles, we know that. I think that's accepted. Will it be really accepted? Will it be really something where we say, okay, that's fine, will Japan and South Korea ever get to the point where they're like, it's okay? Well, even China get to the point where if North Korea keeps testing and doing stuff that they will say it's okay. We don't know. So that's a whatever normal will be for that would have to take a lot of accepting by a lot of countries in the region about where the status quo is there. And I'm not sure when that's going to be, that we're ever okay with them, having that weapon. We know they have it. We kind of accepted that they have it because it's not like they look like they're going to want to get rid of it. And that we're not sending in troops to destroy them. So that's not going to happen. So, but we're not comfortable with it.
We're just about out of time, but maybe I did see Ruby had her hand up, and maybe we could have one short question and a short answer.
Thank you. Quick question. I was wondering if the triangular deterrence relationship, triangular nuclear relationship, Southern Asia, if that informs your priorities in any way with China.
It does. One of the things that we are looking at is how to be more, well, obviously the China situation by alone, but then that whole situation does inform our thinking, and that whole region informs our thinking a lot more at state overall. We're thinking more about how to affect things in the region more in terms of our engagements with countries there. And how that factors into our engagements with countries there. So it has a much bigger effect on how we are thinking about moving forward in engaging countries in that whole region and how do we work with them in the future. So it's a bigger question in terms of how we work with glaciers.
All right, well, I
Do you
think,
have a question, Pat? No last question for me?
well, I had quite a long list of questions for you. I don't know if there's one you're fishing for, but I want to thank you for being willing to be here with us. I have 100 other questions I could ask, but I do want to be respectful of your time and the time of the folks online. And I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank everyone for having joined us and celebrating 25 years of managing the Atom. It is actually a little bit past the actual 25th anniversary as a result of the pandemic and various other things. So it took us a little while to get this organized. And I want to thank all of the people who worked so hard to put these events of the past couple of days together, and in particular, Matt Parent, Francesca Giovannini, Marina Lorenzini, all of whom have been really working hard, and the speakers that we've had the past couple of days. So thank you again. And there will now, for those of you online, it's over, we're done. For those of you here in the room, there is lunch available, and we can continue the conversation of that.
Well, thank you, Matt,
Thanks so
for
much.
having me.